Provost office through a program which they call Actions to Promote Community Transformation, enabled funding for this event to take place today. So I'd like to thank them. Awaz Azar is our moderator. Awaz is if we use the rest of our hours today for introduction, we would fill them. He is a PhD candidate in our community regional planning program, but also he is across the board involved within the city of Austin through a series of boards, commissions, and other non-governmental organizations to try to address housing and homelessness. I will let him give you the more modest version of how he's engaged, but just know that if you need the footnotes, I will be here all day. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Alan. Thank you all so much for being here. It's super exciting. As Alan mentioned, of course, a big thank you to him, to Sarah Wu, to Dior, to Dean Addington, to the Provost Office for giving us the opportunity to put this great conversation together. And definitely a big thank you, not just our panelists, but also the students who really made this come together. So, and Leora and I had a conversation earlier this year. We're going to talk about like what we want to talk about. And it, you know, there was this message sent out to the students, asking students in the School of Architecture, what are you interested in hearing about? What is it that we should be engaging in? And homelessness was something that sort of rose to the top. And it's a conversation architects don't often have with each other, and designers and planners. We don't engage in this conversation often. But it's an important conversation to have. And I really am thankful to our students, Drew, Luda, Logan, for helping us put together these questions that you're going to be seeing, you know, driving a lot of the conversation that we're going to be having today. As I do get started, I do want to do a land acknowledgement. Sadly, the students from our Indigenous and Native American student organization could not be here because of other commitments, but they wanted us to go with the land acknowledgement that they shared. So we would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the indigenous land of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. Moreover, we would like to acknowledge the Alabama, Cushata, Caddo, Carrizo, Comecrudo, Cuautican, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipanapache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and all the American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities that have become part of these lands and territories in Texas, including here at the University of Texas. So really, I think I won't spend a lot of time talking about introducing this conversation because I want to jump into a lot of good discussion with these great folks. But I do want to talk a little bit about each one of our panelists and go over who they are. I do want to say I'm not going to go into a lot of details. Like Alan said, the folks here are very prolific in the work that they do. And if you look at your program, you will see that we have detailed bios for all of them. But I do want to just start by going over some of the brief stuff and talk about how they've been involved in this work. So I'll start with Diana Gray here. Diana has assumed the role of our homelessness strategy officer for the city of Austin starting in January of 2021, bringing 2 decades of experience in affordable housing and social policy affecting low-income households and people experiencing homelessness. Prior to this, she had a consulting practice, and Diana worked as an independent consultant, including doing various other leadership roles, as well as the Texas Director for Corporation for Supportive Housing, CSH. We also have here Rick Archer, and Rick is joining us from San Antonio. And Rick is a fellow for the American Institute of Architects, is a founding principal at Overland Partners, Architecture plus Urban Design, and a design principal focused on projects in the areas of education, healthcare, nonprofit, and urban design. Rick was the principal and lead designer on internationally recognized centers for the homeless, including the Bridge in Dallas and Haven for Hope in San Antonio. And Rick, thank you so much for the work that you're doing in Texas. I'm going to go over to Sarah Steadily. She's currently serving as the Director of Architecture and Site Development for Mobile Loaves and Fishes at Community First Village here in Austin, which is a 51-acre and growing permanent supportive housing community for formerly chronically homeless folks. In this role, she directs the master plan development as the village continues to expand. You'll be seeing a lot of this in the news and a lot of people places where it's covered, as well as the design and construction of homes and community buildings. I'll move on to Jean-Paul Conley. JP, as I call him, is currently the organizing director for Austin Justice Coalition. And with the Austin Justice Coalition, he has played a key role in local efforts to raise new funding for supportive housing and services, helping to convene experiential experts, service providers, and policymakers, and championing new approaches and systems fitted to the needs of a diverse, unhoused community. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Joan Savage Jr., who serves as the regional coordinator for the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness. He's a recognized leader with over 15 years of experience in the fields of homelessness, social policy, economic development, and human services administration. His prior work experience encompasses positions in which he was responsible for overseeing transitional and permanent supportive housing programs, continuum of care funding, strategic planning, and coalition building. So that's a lot. And I'll stop there by simply saying these folks here have worked on this issue in various different aspects and intersections. And I think that's what's going to make today's conversation really exciting. So what we're going to do here is we're going to have our students join us for each one of 3 sections through the afternoon. And we'll be starting off by really digging into some specific conversations around the role of architects, designers, and planners in this entire conversation. Where do we all fit in? And I think that's the first conversation. And so the student that's going to be joining us for that is Du Viragi, who is a graduate urban design master's candidate studying at the University of Texas School of Architecture. He has a Bachelor of Architecture degree from Mumbai University in India, after which he worked as an architect and an urban designer for 3 years for firms in India, Vietnam, and the United States. After through, we're going to be joined by Logan Rogers, who is a senior in the architectural engineering dual degree program. They have contributed on several panels regarding homelessness, college homelessness, and food insecurity. They've also done design and research for Real Stories, a project started by COAC North Texas, which highlighted the stories of homeless college students in the DFW area. In their free time, they like to rock climb and build things out of wood. And lastly, but certainly not least, we will be joined by Lyudmila Yantranova, or Luda. She's a Master of Science in Urban Design candidate and a Fulbright visiting graduate student here at our school. Originally from Russia, she has experience in designing public spaces and organizing workshops on building wooden, street furniture, and art installations. So I'm going to stop right there and really jump into this conversation. I'll get seated with y'all. But really, as starting off with an introductory conversation, what we wanted to ask all of our practitioners here was, can you briefly talk about your work on the issue of homelessness? What is the unhoused population that you engage with? What does that engagement look like? And Diana, if you don't mind, can I ask you to go first?
I'm happy to. First of all, thank you so much for organizing this. I am happy to be here to talk with you and the other folks on the panel today, but also because more years ago than I care to mention, I think, cut my teeth in affordable housing when I was a student, not in the School of Architecture, but at the LBJ school, who at the time really didn't have much policy focus in affordable housing. And so I did coursework with professors, Dr. Oden and Dr. Mueller, and really, I think, gave me and a lot of other people in our space the basis for careers that they care about. So I, as I always said, took the role of Homeless Strategy Officer for the city of Austin just about a year ago. And before that, spent about 20 years, mostly in the development and finance of affordable housing generally, and then permanent supportive housing, which is deeply affordable housing for people exiting chronic homelessness that's really attached to the availability of robust services that they might need to stay stable. The division is new within the city. So city's done work around homelessness for many years, but did not have really a single locus of work. So a couple of years ago, created the Homeless Strategy Division, which sits within Austin Public Health, but works very closely with our Housing Finance Corporation and planning, housing and planning departments. So in Austin, as you may know, on any given day, our best, although certainly conservative and undercounted estimates are there about 3,000 people experiencing homelessness. Almost 2,500 of which are unsheltered, sleeping outside or in a car in a place that's otherwise not meant for habitation. And so our role within the city is pretty broad. We are to make broad strategy recommendations, policy recommendations to leadership and council, and recommendations clearly about the investments that the city makes, which really is a huge, probably the biggest way that the city impacts this issue. Most of our work in homelessness really is done through contracts with nonprofits, with housing developers, et cetera. And the other piece is that the homeless response system, as I'm sure you'll hear from the other panelists, really isn't monolithic. While the city has maybe the largest investment in homeless response in the community, there are a lot of other funds and players at the table that are critical. So we interface with our local homeless coalition, through which about $11 million of HUD funding flows every year, and Homeless Response Leadership Council that has service providers, people with lived expertise, et cetera, our housing authorities, the county, our health district, et cetera. It's a very complex system. And we, at the very least, try to be the primary point of contact for those relationships within the community. So I'll do it.
Wow. So Rick Archer, I'm an architect with Overland Partners, and I am not an expert on homelessness. I've had the privilege of working on a number of facilities that provide housing to those who are unhoused, and also working on projects around trauma-informed care for people who've experienced trauma and abuse. Probably the ones that are best known are the bridge in Dallas, which was a $17 million building designed for 500 people, and the day it opened has housed 1,500 people from that day forward, with extraordinary results. Dallas went from, I want to say they had about 6,500 homeless on the street when the bridge opened, in their point in time count. The next point in time count had them around 650. Now, that doesn't mean all those people were housed, and we'll get into a lot of that they were no longer homeless. We'll get into a lot of definitions, I'm sure, as we get into this. Similarly, in San Antonio, Haven for Hope, we had about 4,500 homeless on the street, point in time count, and after Haven opened, that number was at 450. We still have homeless problems in both those cities, and I would say today the numbers have not changed significantly if we look at them holistically. So there's a lot of questions about what we're doing and how effective we're being at it. The bridge won the Rudy Bruner Award, which is an award given to a piece of architecture every 2 years that has had the greatest impact on societal change in the world because of how it addressed the problem of homelessness. And we've had the privilege of consulting in places like Adelaide, Australia, doing a project in New Zealand for the Maori people, and working in places like Santa Fe and Lubbock and other places around Texas. So my experience is very much on the ground, trying to figure out these problems. How do you solve these problems? And I think this is classic of architects. If we're anything, at least for me, I'm a learner. I like to come alongside experts in those things and then shape a space around that. The uniqueness of the centers that we've done for those who aren't housed is that in both cases, in San Antonio and in Dallas, neither city had a program for the homeless. They had a vision to eradicate homelessness in the next 10 years. Both those projects are almost a decade old. We have not solved that, obviously. But I guess the great thing about that was that no one was coming in and telling us what to do. I ended up having the opportunity to travel around the country and visit most of the homeless centers in the country at the time, and to see how different cities were doing it and to learn from what worked and what didn't work. And then to craft programs literally that began to become the policy of the city in terms of how we addressed homelessness. And I think we'll talk more about that in the role of architects and planners. People often ask me why I got into this area and why I actually really enjoy working with people who live in the margins. And I've had a chance over the years to engage a lot on a personal level with people who are experiencing homelessness. And I think if I reflect back the furthest, when I was 24 years old as a single man, I met a gentleman who was homeless on the streets in Washington, D.C. He was manic, depressive, schizophrenic, psychotic, male prostitute who was selling his body to support his addiction. And he became my roommate for a year. And through that experience of living with someone who was experiencing the kind of trauma that led them to a life on the street. I learned at a deeply personal level what was happening in the life of one man. I don't want to say that's universal by any means, but it put a face to the homeless for me that has profoundly shaped the way I think. About 7 years later, I was married, moved to San Antonio. I got a call from his parents, who had become very good friends. And he came from a very good family. And he was one of 6 kids. The other 5 were wildly successful. And then there was Tom. And they called me and said, we just wanted you to know that they found Tom's body on the side of the road in California. He was struck by a car. And that they identified him from the Bible that you gave him with his name inscribed. And so for me, this is a deeply personal thing that every homeless person I meet is Tom. And how do I, as an architect, do something that could help transform the life, maybe just one person?
All right, good. Thanks for sharing. So I am the Director of Architecture at Mobile Loaves and Fishes. And Mobile Loaves and Fishes is a nonprofit in town. It's been around for 23 years now. For most of that time, we drove food trucks around the city of Boston and served meals to people that were living on streets, in the camps, and tents. And we did that and continue to do that. So through this day, there's 12 trucks that still operate through an incredible team of volunteers. All of those trucks are independently operated by businesses, churches, youth groups, all sorts of groups of people. I think we have like several thousand volunteers that prepare meals and go out on the trucks, which is pretty incredible. To the city of Boston, it's incredible that so many people want to be involved in that. So we did that for most of those 23 years. In 2015, or actually well before that, we started putting some of our friends that we had met on the streets and had known at this point for many years, started putting those people up in RV parks all over the city, because, you know, unfortunately, that's like almost now to this day still like the quickest way to put a shelter over somebody's head. Although of course it's like not necessarily meant for, you know, long-term housing. So we started doing that, and then to varying degrees of success, right? When you're like plucking somebody out of a community that they have built on the streets of people that have had similar experiences to them, and you put them in a pretty unfamiliar place without access to services or things that can kind of help them settle, that's difficult, right, for a lot of people. So the idea was born, let's start our own RV park and see where that takes us. So probably 5, 6, 7 iterations of sites later that we got NIMBY'd out of, we landed with the Community First Village, which is where we operate today. So Community First Village is a project of Mobile Loaves and Fishes, and it's a permanent supportive housing community for specifically chronically homeless folks in Central Texas. We moved our first neighbor in 2015, and today we have, I believe as of today, we have 323 people living at the village. We have, most of those are chronically homeless folks. About 15% of those are what we call missional, so people that may not have experienced homelessness, but feel called to and have the capacity to live at the village to serve the neighbors they live near, to sort of serve as this kind of built-in support network for people as they settle and remain there. My background is in architecture. I got my architecture degree at Tulane in New Orleans, and while I was there, I was pretty involved in what was called the Tulane City Center, is now called the Small Center for Collaborative Design. Great people over there. Did a lot of community focused projects throughout my time there. And I think that sort of helped me develop kind of the values of what I wanted my career to focus around, which was a practice of architecture that was very near to communities, very near to marginalized folks. And was also pretty good friends with a homeless guy that lived in my neighborhood while I lived there. And then I came to Mobile Loaves to volunteer 4 years ago, and I'm here now. So I stuck around, and now I direct all of our real estate development. So we have our current 51-acre property. We're continuing to put that out. It'll have 550 homes by the end of this year. And then in 2020, we started developing 2 new phases So it's approximately 125 acres and about 1,300 units of housing and about 130,000 square feet of supportive services building space. So we're currently in development for that, and we're hoping to break ground on that this year. And I also live on site, so I've lived at the village for 4 years. All of my neighbors are formerly chronically homeless, so I do a lot of life with those people.
Thank you. My name is João Paulo, and call me JP, if that's easier. I am mostly just a local troublemaker here in the community, to be honest, as you may find out by the end of this day. No, but I'm a community organizer, have been for a while now in Austin with the Austin Justice Coalition. And I work with, collaborate with our unhoused neighbors, folks who are currently experiencing homelessness in various forms. Work with folks who are providing services to them, go directly to campsites, interact with various people playing various roles within those systems. Have also experienced, had the opportunity to experience what it's like to advocate for unhoused people trying to receive help and services through our system, and experiencing the classic roundabout that so many people are often thrown into, where you go to one agency or service provider, they send you to the next, that sends you to the next, that sends you to the next, and the person ends up back on the street. So I've had the opportunity to live through that multiple times, which is one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about this issue. And then also interface with, I'm one of the, I give Diana a headache every once in a while, and other folks at the city, and just, other service providers in the community, and trying to sort of, make space in these conversations for voices and perspectives that often don't make it onto the shiny report that organizations send to their funders at the end of every year. So I see the presence and role of AJC as a convener that brings folks together that don't often talk to each other, and makes them sit down together and have conversations, and also a disruptor that listens to the shiny success story and says, well, that might not be exactly what we're seeing on the streets right now. But that's kind of a little bit of who I am, and I'm sure that we'll all get to know each other a little better throughout the course of this conversation.
Great. We need troublemaking and disruptors in this field, in this work.
Welcome,
Joe
headaches.
Savage. My experience with homelessness starts out personally. I was a grad student at the University of Pennsylvania, getting a master's in social work and a master's in urban planning, and I was homeless. You would have no idea that I was homeless because I didn't look like what you thought homeless was. And so I started out couch surfing, and then finished the remainder of my graduate education living in my car. And with my trusty student ID, I could get into the locker to take a shower. I had access to the dorms. I could wash my clothes. I went to every student event that had food so I could eat. I did every psychology, every Penn Med study that offered money so I could have a little change in my pocket. But no one out of the thousands of people on that campus knew that I was homeless. And so my interest in homelessness really started out in looking at how we perceive who's homeless and what that perception is, and how we perceive the reasons why people are homeless. Most people think people are homeless as a result of some moral flaw, something that they've done wrong and it's their fault, not understanding that we have a lot of systemic issues that are the problem. And so that's where my interest started out. So I started out in coalition building, doing some community organizing. And one day I had an epiphany, and I realized a lot of the people that are making homeless policy at the top have no idea about what it really looks like on the ground and what effective policy really means. So you have policy that implements programs, but are these policies really implementing programs that are really working, that are really helping people who are unhoused get off the street and to remain safely housed? So I kind of had this epiphany. I said, you know what? The folks in policy have no idea what they're doing, and people on the ground need to have their voices heard up in those levels of policy. So I started a career trajectory in terms of looking at urban and social policy, particularly as it relates to affordable housing, homelessness, community and economic development. So my first job that kind of got my feet wet in the policy arena was with the city of Philadelphia, where I oversaw their continuum of care program grant. And so I managed that grant for a few years and then worked my way up to oversee their permanent supportive housing as well as their transitional housing programs, and really looking at policy, looking at compliance, and just really making sure that the voices of people who are living on the street, who are living in shelter, are heard and are incorporated in policy making decisions. So I started there with the city of Philadelphia, and again, still having the epiphany, the federal government just really isn't getting it right. And they really need people that really understand what's going on in those positions. So I took my job working for the city of Philadelphia, and eavesdropping. Let me tell you, eavesdropping can work in your favor if you ever have a chance. I'm going to meet a colleague in her office, but she was in there with someone else. And so instead of going back to my office and coming back to her office later, I decided to eavesdrop on their conversation. Don't ask me why. And so I hear the gentleman talk and say, you know what? There's a position open at the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness. And immediately I ran back to my office, looked it up on their website, looked at the position for a regional coordinator, and that's what I'm doing today. I'm a regional coordinator with the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness. We're the federal government's body that's responsible for coordinating the federal response to homelessness. So we coordinate 19 federal agencies so that they're all speaking the same language. They have a common vision in terms of what it means to end homelessness. And one of the things that I really take pride in terms of what I do with my job, you know, in dealing with homeless policy and developing at federal level, as a regional coordinator, I help communities understand what that policy means for them. So if a policy priority comes out at the federal level, how does that get implemented in Austin? What does that mean for what homelessness looks like in Austin? And so typically in our position, we'll go have a conversation, you know, with the mayor, we'll have a conversation with the providers. We may even have a conversation with the governor of Texas, but in all of those conversations, I was realizing where are the conversations with the people who are actually living it? Where are the conversations with the people that are actually on the street? Where is their involvement in policy? So that's what I really like to focus on in my work, in my region as a regional coordinator, helping communities understand this policy, but also making sure the voices of those with lived expertise are also heard and involved in the policy and decision making. So that's who I am, Joe.
I appreciate that, Joe. I guess this is a really, great, can show the breadth of the experience that we have here. Folks who are working on things from a system perspective, people who are looking at things on the ground, people who are organizing, people who are working with government institutions at different levels. So you can really see the breadth of the conversation. One thing I want to mention is homelessness, and I've been involved in this conversation for a while, has a terminology and language of its own that we tend to throw out at people. We did have a small glossary of terms at the back of your program that can help you, but there's one thing that's not in here and got mentioned up here, the continuum of care. So let me just tell y'all that they can, and somebody else can help me as well, but the continuum of care is a HUD program that allows us to have a community-wide system and impact on working on a lot of these issues. And so that's what we're talking about, this community-wide effort that exists in a lot of communities around the country, including here in Austin, that has its own continuum of care with the Leadership Council. So I do want to jump right into our first theme, which is really looking at the roles of architects, planners, and designers. And we had a bunch of sub-questions that our students helped us come up with, and I do want to mention them, and I know folks are interested. So really, what is the role of architects, planners, and designers in creating housing opportunities, influencing policy, and collaborating with social services in this arena? And on the other hand, what role do these fields play in creating hostile and antagonistic environments? At the same time, how does our understanding of public versus private space and temporary versus permanent space affect our understanding of landscapes and cities, and how can we utilize these experiences and understandings for the benefit of our unhoused neighbors? And I'm not going to go order, so anyone can jump in. Anyone can jump in at any time.
Well, Sarah, we're the two architects up here, right?
So
All right.
better for worse.
You better jump in.
It's even worse, probably.
Wanna start?
Sure, I'll start. I mean, I bet some of you in this room can relate to this. You know, as an architect, I feel like I'm like fundamentally a generalist, right? With like a whole host of like very divergent interests. And so, you know, part of me is like, yeah, we need to be involved in all of that, right? Like, and I do think that design education does do a good job of creating or helping students sort of like understand how to create a problem solve. Like, how do you see things from like a number of different angles? And when you think you've seen them all, like turn your model over and see it from that angle, right? Like, I think design education does a good job of that. And I would say also, like, I think our secret weapon probably out of all of that is our ability to imagine like what people can't see and then to illustrate that to people. And hopefully through like making a real thing, right? Either making like a drawing or a model of thing, but hopefully eventually making a real thing. And so I love that that's kind of the secret weapon, I think, of designers, is being able to like imagine something that nobody can even imagine and then make that thing happen. That being said, I don't think that we can architecture our way out of complex social issues, right? That's true for homelessness, that's true for any complex social issue. And so in the same way that I think that we can take a bunch of kind of independent concepts and figure out a way, not just to make them function together, but to create like harmony out of them, right? To create a thing that's greater than the sum of its parts. And so I think that we can do that with things and ideas, and we can also, I think, do that with people and groups in collaboration. And I think that's really the key, right? Like, definitely mobilism dishes does something one way, but like we can't be the only answer. I think the more that I'm in the role that I'm in now, which is doing a lot of kind of master planning, like coordinating with a lot of residents and stakeholders and team members and all sorts of architects and engineers from all over the city, I feel like more and more that I'm in that role, I become convinced that designers' true goal is really helping people define the problem, right? Like, we think that we can go to our clients or whoever, and they're going to tell us what they need. And I really feel like as designers, our goal is to be like, tell me more about what you're experiencing so that we can look at this from all the angles and figure out the thing you think you need is actually the thing that might solve the issue that you're having. And so I think being able to like ask really good questions is super important. I think being able to figure out who the right stakeholders might be and make sure that those people are coming to the table and represented so that we get that side of the issue. So that's kind of where I see, I think, people that are design educated playing the most effective role.
Yeah, I love that thought. Second grader once told me that creativity is what you do when you don't know what to do. And in this field, and what we're doing as we try to address this issue of housing those who don't have housing, we are faced often with a situation where we don't know what to do. And if we did, we would have already done it. So we're facing a massive housing crisis in the world, not just in America. And obviously that's having the greatest impact on those who live at the lowest income level, or those who are dealing with other issues such as mental health issues or other crises, trauma in their lives. You know, what's been interesting to me as we've gotten into this is that, and I mentioned this earlier, in every case when we've been invited in, our client has had no idea what they were going to do to solve the problem. They just said, we have to address it, and we're going to solve the problem. We've passed a law that we're going to end homelessness in this amount of time. And then it became our job, literally as the architects, to figure out how we were going to do that. Not just how to design a building, but what would be the program that would support them? How would we house people? You know, what kind of an environment would they be in? Would it be a courtyard? Would it be single gender, mixed gender? Would it be by age? Would it be families with children or not? I mean, and this is being thrown at us as an architect, me leading these and going, I have no idea. I really don't know what the solution is. But together, we're going to begin to figure it out. And it begins, I think, with what you said, Sarah. It really begins with listening. You know, we've got to first be incredibly good listeners. And that means inviting the people who are going to be a part of the buildings that were created to the table for a conversation. When we were selected to do the bridge in Dallas, our design team went to the site. We spent time talking to the homeless people who were encamped there. We got to know them. We had them describe to us what were the situations and the conditions in the city that were causing them to be where they were. And when we went to the interview, we were interviewing for this. We had actually been a finalist for the Wiley Performing Arts Center that ultimately world famous architects were selected to do, and we weren't, but the city kept our portfolio aside and called us and said, we'd like you all to submit for this homeless center. And went to the interview, and my partner began to describe the site and how we might respond to it. And then he paused and he said, you know what, actually, I'm just going to share with you what one of the homeless men told us, because it's a better understanding of the site than anything I could tell you. And he began to describe it. And the gentleman who was chairing the committee, who Dallas called their homeless czar, which I find a really fascinating term, stopped us and he said, wait a minute, what was the name of that guy? And we said, well, it was Willie. He said, was his name Willie? And we're like, yeah, Willie Hickerson. And he said, I was on site today and Willie asked who I was. And I told him, and told him that we were going to select architects today. And he said, well, hire those guys from San Antonio because they actually care. They're the only ones who came and talked to us. And so we were hired to do that project because of the recommendation of the homeless family. If we are going to be architects who are going to solve these problems, we've got to be in the trenches talking to the people that we're working with. That project ended up winning a National Design Award. And when I went up to receive the award, the chairman of the committee invited, and mind you, there's probably 1,000 people in the audience at these design awards ceremonies. And she asked, are there any questions about any of the projects? And the other award winners were ridiculously expensive, high-end, just over the top designs. But the only questions anyone in the audience asked were about the homeless center that we designed. And so she said, well, the architects in the audience, would you come up here? And I answered questions, took questions for a few minutes. And when I came off the stage, that year's AIA gold medalist, who had also won an award, approached me and he said, you sound more like a social worker than an architect. And it was not a compliment. And I turned to him and I said, thank you. We need to be willing to get it. One of the things that was interesting about all of our stories is that we all have personally encountered the homeless, lived with the homeless, been homeless, spend time with the homeless. You don't do this at a distance. You don't do architecture at a distance. You do it by being in the thing that you're doing. And this one's messy. Another award winner, when they received their award, said, maybe someday someone will go spend time with people who live on the margins, but we certainly did it. This is our profession. Actually, maybe getting into how the ways we work against it, but we need to understand policy. We need to understand the politics of getting these things done. And we need to be people who are helping to shape it, not sitting back and just being accidental tourists along the way and making pretty buildings that don't make a difference in people's lives.
And I also think something that is key in terms of the role that we have as planners, architects, and designers is to approach our work from an equity lens. And what I mean by an equity lens, you really have to be mindful of the fact that, let's say you're working on a project, you're designing a building or you're building a community, you have to ask the broader question, what is going to be the social and economic impact of this project on that community? And when we talk about homelessness, is this project going to prevent homelessness? Meaning, is it going to provide opportunities for people who are low income? Is it going to provide opportunities for affordable housing? Or is it going to contribute to homelessness because it's going to gentrify the neighborhood and push people out so that they can't afford to live there. So in the work that we do, we always have to approach it from an equity lens by looking at the broader picture and asking the question, what is the impact on the community? And if you're working for a particular entity, letting that client know, listen, I understand this is the kind of project you want, but I also want you to understand the impact that your project is going to have. And there are a lot of policies at the local level that deal with zoning, regulatory barriers, et cetera. Be an advocate for changing some of these policies that really exclude people who are low income, that really contribute to the issue of homelessness. So always approach your work from an equity lens. And I really believe that that also begins, and it was mentioned previously, at the education level. You know, you're getting your degree, and do you really understand why cities are shaped the way that they're shaped? Why certain pockets of people live here in the community? Why do you always see an industrial region that once you cross over it, you're now in the lower income part of the city, but then on the other side of the train tracks is a totally different thing. So you're learning how to understand cities. You're learning about cities and how to design cities and how to design buildings, but do you know why cities are the way that they are today? Why we have the suburbs the way that we have. So really getting that broader picture, that broader equity understanding is really key to the work that we do as planners, as architects, and as designers.
Yeah, no, please go for it. So just to add to that, like, because I'm also an urban designer and architect, so I feel like architects, planners, and designers have this huge social responsibility in a way, because we are designing our built environments, and we have to be really contextual of what we're designing. And I feel the privatized nature of architecture in our cities doesn't really sort of help the homeless population that is currently in the cities. And kind of when I look at cities, especially in the US, I see that the architecture is very monofunctional in nature, and it needs to be more adaptable to the spaces of the communities that are surrounding. And then because I'm from Mumbai, which is like very dense city, and it's sort of addressing these issues of homelessness through like the ephemeral nature of the city itself, you kind of see how the impermanence and the like informalities of the city start playing into nature. And then you kind of see how like these hostile places that you usually see, like the concrete spikes under the bridges, or like the bench partitions, like they really affect how like spaces within the cities are designed for the homeless people. And then like in Mumbai, I was also seeing how like huge buildings of like parking structures have been trying to convert into homeless shelters at night, and like these kind of initiatives where you start seeing typologies of buildings itself adapting to the nature of the community that is surrounding it. So just to sort of look at us as a profession, I feel if all of these designers and architects, like all of us sort of become like a collective to sort of voice the homeless population, I feel that could be a good start to see how we can address this issue in cities.
You know, building off that, I'm not a designer, I'm not an architect, so I get to, but I do have thoughts. You know, I think that we have to avoid always I really appreciate the comments made about listening to our unhoused neighbors, listening to folks experiencing homelessness. And I think we do have to also avoid the trap of a kind of architectural determinism, which I can sort of see often in various conversations. Just because you design something a certain way doesn't mean that sort of that determines how folks will interact with the space that you designed. There's still people, complex animals interacting with that space. And so I think that there's an important part of this conversation is that there's a, you know, particularly in the homeless response system, there's a cultural piece that's constantly in dialogue with the built environment. And the cultural piece is undergoing a lot of change right now. And the culture in our response system sort of affects the built environment, and then the built environment affects the culture. And, you know, the old culture in the homeless response system in many of our cities is a culture that sort of subjects, well, there's many parts to it, right? But it sort of subjects people to a kind of moral triage to see who deserves services and ranks people based on desert, right? So, oh, this person is a veteran, they've served their community, therefore they are more worthy of housing, right? Oh, this person is a mother, a family, children, more worthy, right? So we rank people on that. Oh, this person has substance use issues, less worthy. So we have that in our culture very much embedded. That's the old culture. I think the new culture moves towards this kind of housing first idea, and beyond even just housing first, the idea that, you know, as a basic health and human rights intervention, start from making housing, shelter, and resources available to people from the get-go, regardless of, you know, their moral desert or anything of that nature. But that the tension between the old culture and the new culture is still very present within every aspect of the system, and the tendency to try to make decisions about who deserves to be on the street. And then that plays back into the questions about the built environment, because then you start having conversations about what you're designing, what you're building, and old culture ideas come into play around ideas that suggest things like, well, if you make it too nice, then the unhoused folks will want to stay too long and they won't be motivated to move on and kind of get a job or fix their lives up. So don't make it too nice for the unhoused people, right? Don't make it, you know, there's lots of things like that that are spoken or unspoken, right? Oh, this is too nice to be sheltered. This is not nice enough. These kinds of questions really come into play in choices that architects and designers make along with you know, different policy institutions and agencies. And the last thing on that note is that, sorry, I had a small blank moment here, but as we're talking about the shift in, you know, so someone else.
I'll go in. I'll start.
I had something to say.
Break
I had something
in,
to
break
say.
in when you're
Come back.
break in when you're ready,
It's
JP.
been a long week.
So I mean, I would agree. I think that, you know, as I thought about this, I sort of thought about, you know, macro as well as sort of at the project level. And so I think, you know, from my perspective, you know, our housing policy, our development policies, our codes, et cetera, have generally been over many years developed sort of with the assumption of affluence, right? So we design for affluence. And then we try to figure out how to aftermarket, you know, and we see these kinds of projects for, you know, either people exiting homelessness or just very low income people generally as boutique. Isn't that nice? We're doing this project, right? And we're,
And for ownership, not just affluence.
yes,
We're
absolutely.
designed for ownership.
That's right.
That's right.
And we had designed for affluence in the residential housing as well as in the surrounding built environment. So I think this is not boutique. This is not boutique work, right? This is every community. I would like very much to be a community that does not have homelessness. That's what we're all driving toward. But you know what? We are always going to be a community where people have medical crises, where people live with just, you know, potentially disabling behavioral health conditions. And we got to figure out how, obviously, there's a lot of social service complexity here as well, but how our housing policy and our development policy acknowledges that, you know, we are a multi-layered and lots of different experiences in the community that we need to accommodate. And then I want to go to the project level. And first I am going to say that, like, I've worked on a lot of projects in which the design is so critical, and it's so important because most people who are exiting homelessness into housing, and that, you know, they are extremely marginalized. Their experience communicated to them over and over again is, you do not have value to this community, right? And you mentioned trauma-informed design. I'm really interested in hearing more about that, because we know people are coming with such experiences of trauma, often over the course of their lives, that it's so critical to their stabilization and thriving that the place they're in communicates to them and accommodates their needs. Now, I will say it also happens to make our work easier in creating more housing. So when I have a beautiful permanent supportive housing project and I have neighbors that are freaking out and Williamson County's suing us, you know, because we're going to do permanent supportive housing, I can go, no, come with me. We're going to go visit this project, right? And it changes, it can shift that perception. So now I've talked about the fantastic ways that, you know, individual project design can work. And now I'm going to pitch a little bit because I promised Elise I would. So one is the Scarlet H. homeless people, right? Homeless is not a type of person. Homelessness is a crappy situation. It's a complex situation. And, you know, often when we look at designing, and I'm speaking mostly, but not solely to permanent housing here, we design housing that says it's forever identifiable. You, despite living there and having a permanent place to live, you're still a homeless person, because we know that's where the homeless people live. And there are good reasons, and I have supported and participated in many projects where all of the residents were people who had exited homelessness, right? But I think we really got to be thoughtful about giving people choice, because a lot of people I want to be in an apartment where nobody knows I ever experienced that unless I'm good and ready to tell them, right? And so the othering of people experiencing homelessness as a permanent kind of underclass, even if we rehouse them, is a real issue, I think. The next piece is that, and this is more, I think, broadly a kind of design issue. We need and want innovation in this space, and design education encourages experimentation and play and all of that. We got to be really careful about when are we innovating for the benefit of people experiencing homelessness, and when are we experimenting on them because they don't have a choice, right? So we get the number of calls we get at the city. We have this fantastic idea. What if we use old, airplanes for housing and whatever, Yeah. And you're just like, or it could be an apartment. And so,
Good housing.
right, and even materials that we're interested in exploring, and it's a valid exploration, right? But being really intentional about, would people choose this? Because, let's be honest, when we look at the exploration of materials, sometimes we find out it really didn't work. And do we want to do that in housing or facilities that are serving a really vulnerable
Are we
population?
using our unhoused neighbors as like experimental subjects in
Correct.
our plethora of
Yeah.
different?
You ready now,
Design
JP?
Yeah, well, that was the perfect segue, because that was exactly what it kind of touches on the last thing I was going to say, which is often homelessness is an aesthetic question for a lot of people, and it becomes treated as a question of aesthetics. Is it visible or is it not visible? If I see it, it makes me uncomfortable. If I have to walk by a homeless encampment on the street, then that's incredibly uncomfortable. Something's got to be done about this. If I don't see it, well, is there really even a problem anymore? I don't know, I don't care. So a lot of it comes down to aesthetics. And then that touches on the design questions, because a lot of times when folks are designing things for our unhoused neighbors, they tend to, again, want to sort of overcompensate on the aesthetic side as a way of saying, look, this is for homeless people, but it's really pretty and cute and nice and so on and so forth. And I have to talk about the Arch, which is our homeless shelter downtown, because I don't personally know any of the folks who designed it, but every time I walk by there, and over the past week, I had the opportunity to pick up several people who were outside of the Arch in puddles of ice and frozen blankets because they didn't have space to sleep inside. I think what would have happened if the sort of designers and folks who had thought through the plan for this building for only 100 people hadn't thought about seriously increasing the capacity. I mean, how many lives could have been saved if we hadn't built a 5-story building instead of a 2-story building with a giant innovative rainwater collection storage system on the roof? I mean, I just keep thinking, okay, the rainwater storage system is really cool, but could we have fit an extra 50 beds if we had designed a whole other floor? So, but whose priorities were taken into account when we designed that building? And why was this kind of innovative rainwater collection system so high a priority? And I don't know what those conversations were like. It was designed before I got involved in any of this, but I think that's just one example is top of mind for me because I interact with that space a lot. But sometimes this relation between form and functionality or whatever it is, we need to think about kind of really addressing the needs and not sacrificing our ability to do so for a kind of a really pretty design. I'm all for pretty designs. I love them, but I think we need to think about that.
Well, it's interesting, when we were working on Haven for Hope, the client representative came to us and they said, put the building in the middle of the site, build yards around it with a tall fence and concertina wine. They're like, no, we're not gonna do that. This was a bad part of the city. They had closed streets. It was a mess. And we said, why don't we restore the city while we build the homeless center? Why don't we restore the streets back to their original locations? Why don't we reconnect it as good urban design, which you would do on any project? This happens to be for the homeless. Now, we have families with children and we have single men in the same facility. Those are real issues. Substance abuse is a real issue. Mental health is a real issue. It's not cute. It's not something that we say, oh, wouldn't it be fun too? These are serious things that we have to deal with. And there are serious concerns about what happens when a single man who has a mental health patient comes in contact with a 5-year-old child. And how do we manage that? But how do we manage that without putting up walls between them? And so we pushed all the buildings out to the perimeter and created a series of courtyards, one for the men, one for the women, one for the families, and the courtyards are all interconnected around a central courtyard and a street. So they can go walk the street together, and they do. They spend the evenings out in the town square, walking the street, going to the chapel, engaging with one another. But there are secure zones. When if somebody has moved out of the male courtyard and into that area, then security knows, well, we're going to keep a better eye on that. And if a mom feels unsafe because she's coming out of an abusive situation, she may choose to stay in the family courtyard with her kids. And what's beautiful about it is that we actually imagined, okay, if we do actually solve homelessness, wouldn't it be great to give this back to the city? Right? We aren't creating something the city doesn't want. We're creating something the city actually wants to have. And we were also told no benches because that would promote laziness. I'm like, you gotta be kidding. I mean, this is about being human beings. People sit, they have a conversation, they stroll together. One of my favorite stories when we opened was we opened the men first, and it was men only in the facility. And I have to tell you, it was a pretty rough place. And into that, we then opened the women and children's area, the family area. And we opened on Labor Day with the goal of filling it by Memorial Day. On Labor Day, the families were lined up on the street with their children, with their suitcases full of clothes, and it filled in one day. And what we saw happen to the place in 24 hours, it went from being a jungle to being a place of laughter, of community, of joy. And the men who were acting horribly before, all of a sudden began to take responsibility for themselves and for the people around them. And it radically shifted the whole dynamic. There are not many shelters in the country that allow women and children in the same facility with men. But I will tell you, it was one of the best things that we did in creating a healthy community. And I know at Community First, you have all kinds of people living there.
Yeah.
And I love the fact that it's community first. It's not housing first. It's actually community first.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is so interesting, everybody. So many thoughts. A few things. I think number one, I think Joe, you brought up a great point about what thinking about the social impact of what we're building and making it an asset to everybody. And I think, so we run a community that's about 8 miles east of downtown. It's really not that far, but it does at this point feel pretty geographically far. Although probably it'll, in 5 years be super connected with the way that Austin's growing. But, we didn't do that on purpose, right? We did that because we couldn't get land to do that anywhere in the city. And so that's kind of how it ended up. So it's been interesting to sort of sit back and reflect on what is it like to have a community? of mostly people that have all experienced pretty profound homelessness. I mean, the average age at the time, the average time on the streets spent by one of our neighbors is 9 years. So some less, but many more. Many have way more years than that. What is it like to have a community of people like that, 300 people, 200 and I think 70 something of which have experienced many, many years of homelessness, all in the same place, all pretty far from other stuff, you know, what is that like? And it's been kind of interesting. First of all, it's true, like we're not technically, we're connected to housing first, but that's not exactly what we're doing, right? We're creating a permanent supportive community. And really like underlying that is our value that, you know, the root cause of profound chronic homelessness, like is this like really big breakdown of support systems, right? Our founder would say a catastrophic loss of family or support systems. I would imagine that for most people in this room, maybe not everybody, but for a lot of people, you know, if something really catastrophic happened in your life, you have a few people that you could go to sleep on the couch or to kind of take you in to help you out or to loan you money or things like that. And so for a lot of our neighbors, again, neighbors that have experienced years and years and years of homelessness, that's a subset of all homeless, that for those people, like they've experienced this breakdown in that support system. And that's for a variety of reasons, and they're all connected, right? Like there's mental health issues, there's addiction issues, there's all of these things that contribute to that, right? And so when you start to kind of get at the root cause and say, okay, we've broken down this support system, then it starts to kind of help us understand like housing is an important piece of this. Again, talking specifically about chronically homelessness, but it's not the only piece, right? So housing alone cannot get at that root cause. So that's why like we started by saying, how can we create a community? And housing is a huge part of that, right? Housing is what settles people. So, you know, there's a lot of other things we do at the community, which we'll go into it in a little bit. But what I wanted to say is that we think a lot about, you know, we do have a community where a lot of people that have experienced homelessness live. Can we, even in that location, when we first started building there, you know, the neighbors freaked out, right? They said all of our property values are going to go down, all of this great stuff's going to happen. We've not had a single person that lives at the village go into any of the surrounding neighborhoods and commit any crimes. In fact, we've had several crimes reported on our property where neighbors from the surrounding neighborhoods have come into our community and committed crimes. And so it's a very safe place to live. But what I'm trying to get at is that we seek to be an asset to the communities around us, right? We want to be a place where people want to come. So it's not just a place that serves the people that live there, but we want to be able to provide assets, whether that's clinics or a voting location. You know, we have activities like movie nights. We have all sorts of things where we want to be an asset that connects not just our community, but all the communities in that area. And the last thing I would say this, and this maybe we'll go into this kind of like public versus private space conversation, which I'd love to hear more about. But you know, I think we could probably all agree that like we don't do a great job really in this country of creating good public space, and that's for a variety of reasons. You know, we don't really value that probably as a culture broadly, but it does make me think a lot about like how do we create quality private space? Like in a lot of ways, privacy is kind of a privilege, right? We've talked a little bit about how it's like about ownership, it's about some other things, and so. What does that look like? What does privacy look like at different scales? Obviously, at the housing scale, giving somebody a door that they can shut and lock promotes a sense of security. And I mean, all sorts of other things, ownership, like it's true safety. What does that look like at a community scale? It's pretty interesting because like at our community, anybody can come to the community at any point in time and walk on the property. But we do have like vehicle gates that close at night. And so it cracks me up a little bit because it's like, we're just like a suburban gated community, just like any of the other ones. And a big part of that is because like we do have a vulnerable population that lives there, right? So the reality is we do have people that come in that don't have the best interest of our neighbors in mind in the middle of the night. And so we feel a need to protect people. But it's interesting to think about like, how do we like commodify private space in a way that actually is like an asset to people that traditionally have not had access to like quality private space. So I'm interested to think about.
Thank you all. I'm glad there's not a mic in front of me because I'm sitting here. So I'm glad y'all did not hear me. And I think lots of thoughts, lots of amazing thoughts. Thank you all. And I think there was something that sort of bubbled to the top was the sort of the social responsibility and the social impact of the work that folks do as architects and designers. And I think we had a really good conversation on what to do, but there's like a what not to do part of this conversation, and that's that antagonistic and hostile architecture conversation. Rick, like you were saying, right, like not having a bench because folks are gonna get lazy. And we see this in the way we've designed our public spaces, and we've started putting partitions and benches so folks can actually not lie down on them or use them in a specific way, or in places where there's no benches at all. And there's so many different examples, but I would love to hear from y'all about sort of this ways architects have also engaged in creating hostile environments for unhoused folks. And how do we counter that or do better as fields and as societies?
I think one of the key things to keep in mind is that when you are designing a space or designing a building, and let's say even if we're talking about public space, and in that actual design, really asking the question, who are we designing this for? And if we're designing this space for the public, who are we really talking about when we say public? Because if we design the space so that there aren't any benches, or if we design the space so that you can't lay down, then what we're really saying is the space is designed for a certain population of the public, but not the entire public. So I really think when it comes down to architecture and it comes down to design with that social responsibility, just really being aware of, okay, what is the impact of this design and who are we really designing for? And really understanding that the social impact that will have on the community.
I'm just jumping here and say that to all the architects in the room, you could all make a choice and a commitment to refuse to take on projects that assign you to design hostile features in the built environment. You could push back on that in your future careers, and I hope you do. A hero of mine is Father Julio Lancelotti in Sao Paulo, who works with the unhoused people in Brazil. And he he's a 68-year-old Catholic priest who took a sledgehammer to concrete spikes that had been installed under the overpass to stop unhoused people from camping. He was out there trying to destroy the spikes with a sledgehammer, and he called them the stones of injustice. And I think about that so much because I think that this was the work of some designer, some architect, responding to a charge given by, the department they worked for, urban planning in Sao Paulo. But we see these choices made all the time. We see these choices right now made by Cat Metro and all of our bus stops here in Austin, where we have the partitioned benches and we have the covering that's meant to not really cover anything, right? It doesn't keep you dry and it doesn't keep you cool. But we see these kinds of design choices be made, but architects could make the choice not to. But there's another thing that I want to add, which is aside from the sort of deliberate, intentional hostile features in built environment, unhoused folks, by and large, except for the few that own cars, are pedestrians. And so much of our built environment, particularly here in Texas, is hostile to pedestrians in every possible way. It prioritizes vehicles. Just experiment with walking around and crossing under I-35, or try to be a pedestrian on Airport Boulevard. See how frequently there's a crosswalk. So design features that are hostile towards pedestrians in general are going to be their violence is going to be most directly felt by our unhoused brothers and sisters. So I think there's another, for those of you who are thinking we're going to get into transportation related planning and stuff like that, to also think about that component of it, the way we prioritize parking space, right? And just think about how much could be done in terms of housing if we had, every time I walk by some of these big strip malls that we have, or the Hancock Center right here next to campus, right? And I'm not even going to get into talking about some of our urban golf courses that allocate, just acres and acres of land to empty grass fields in Austin. But there are real choices that can be made, and I hope that all of our future architects will be bold in making those choices.
I want to challenge something you said.
Okay. I love it.
Sometimes you just say no, but I will say if we don't say yes and then enter in and reshape the way that client is thinking, then it's going to happen. It's going to happen wrong, and that's not a good answer. So when we took on Haven for Hope, the client said it is going to be a building in the middle of a concertina wire surrounded facility, and we are not going to let people in and out of here. And we got hired, and we said, well, is there a different way to think about this? What is the outcome that we're really looking for? We now have benches there. We created shady courtyards. We created places because we dared to say, we're going to step into this. We're going to listen well to the people who are not occupants of these buildings. I hate that word. I mean, take that out of your language. These are people who are participants in, who help create the spaces that we have helped create a framework for. But we have got to dare to step into those places and be smart enough and knowledgeable enough and listen well enough and design solutions that are better. And they'll go, yes, that's better than what I was thinking. We can do that.
So I have a quick like
Sometimes
sub-question.
it's no.
Yeah, I have a quick sub question on that. Like when you talk about sort of convincing these clients about projects, like incorporating this aspect as well. So are there any kind of impact metrics that like anyone is looking at, whether it's like the quantitative data that's sort of used to convince the clients, or like a qualitative narrative that you form for them?
Great question.
Yeah.
So
Go ahead.
I know in the city of Philadelphia, there's a great woman who's leading a lot of the homeless work there, Sister Mary Scullion, Project Home. And she wanted to develop permanent supportive housing for chronically homeless individuals in Center City, Philadelphia. So imagine that, Center City, Philadelphia, affordable housing for the homeless. And so, of course, the community in their concern, well, this is going to lower our property values, it's going to bring crime to our neighborhood, et cetera. And I can say today, she has been successful in getting 4 permanent supportive housing projects developed in downtown Philadelphia. Why? Because they built the housing and they used the first one as a pilot, and then they looked at the data. They looked at the property values, they looked at the crime rate, and guess what? The property values went up.
Yep.
And increased substantially. And so the study that really came out of that really proved that the perception that is out there that if these people come, if you build housing for them in our neighborhood, it's going to have this overall negative effect. But the data from what we saw in Philadelphia showed that it was actually the opposite.
But it's not just because, I mean, design's a part of it. In Los Angeles, there are 2 homeless centers right across the street from each other, about the same size, LA Mission and Midnight Mission. One of them is absolutely despicable, and the other one is absolutely beautiful. You walk around the sidewalk around Midnight Mission, it's immaculate. They take care of it. They're great neighbors. The LA Mission, I haven't been there for 10 years, so this is what it was. It may have changed. So how it was managed and how it was cared for made a huge difference. In Dallas, every neighbor was opposed to us building a bridge. It's in the shadow of City Hall, between City Hall and the market. Really important real estate. And we gathered a neighborhood coalition, got them meeting with the homeless, with the police, and we asked, well, what are your concerns? Trash, vagrancy, et cetera. And we developed a 3-way coalition between the neighbors, the homeless, and the city to actually monitor and clean the city. So the homeless are the people who are out in the streets making the city better. And the main opponent of ours, after it opened, came out in the newspaper and said, I've changed my mind. This has increased my property values. This has improved the neighborhood. This is one of the best things that's ever happened. So it is design, but it's also really looking at the programmatic pieces that shape that. And I think as designers, we have to enter into that space.
Sorry, I feel like you want to say something.
I would say one other thing. We wear a lot of hats with nonprofit. I'm sure all of you can relate. And it's like one of my de facto roles in the last couple of years has been sort of a de facto like facilities manager. And so it's interesting to go from an architecture brain of being like, I designed something, it's built, and I move on, you know, to then having to care for the thing in like a long-term way. And that will fundamentally change the way you think about building stuff. I would encourage everybody to spend some time trying to manage a built thing. It is very interesting. And it just makes me think like, yes, absolutely, architects are responsible for design decisions that result in hostile architecture and you know, things that are not inclusive to all types of people. That being said, I actually think that a lot of what we see as, you know, hostile environments comes from like lazy facilities management. and I think that tells me two things. Like number one, that I think people that are involved in design need to be involved in long-term care of buildings beyond just build it and move on. Because so much of how a building happens after you get your certificate of occupancy. And it's got a whole life ahead of it. It's a living organism. So that's one. And then I think two, like when I say lazy, it's not meant to be like a moralistic judgment. It's mostly just like there's it's just like you're not thinking about all the reasons why this thing could be happening, right? Like if there's I was working with a church actually downtown here where there was a lot of people coming into their parking garage late at night and like creating a mess, and they were saying, can you design us or can you know point us to a designer that can design some big iron gates for these doors? And that was their first thing. And yet, kind of like you're saying, Rick, like it requires us coming in and being like, wait, let's sit down and figure out like what the problem actually is, right? And so
Is it the people or is it the traffic?
yeah. And can we come up with like other ways to like manage this space in a way that we can actually kind of like subvert that issue, you know? So.
Yeah, that's good.
So I guess I'll just add one thing and then we can definitely want to get a question from folks here as well. So like the token planner on here, I think I will take a lot of fault among the professions for the planners also saying where folks get to be housed. I think that's a big question. It's funny, over lunch, Diana and I were talking about the encampments. When the city decided to have sanctioned encampments and saying, here's areas where you can camp. Well, there was a bit of a war on who gets the sanctioned encampment. Are those areas that already have a lot of poverty, where folks are already marginalized? Are we going to send it there? Are we going to do what Sarah's saying with Village First, where we decide, oh, well, not in the city of Austin, we're going to send you right to our ETGR, edge of the city, not in our city. And so really a lot of conversation has to be, where do we think folks can live and how do we value folks and their housing needs and our own communities within our cities and jurisdictions. So I did want to just mention that. I will open it up right now to maybe one or two questions. We will have a conversation, a chance at the end of the day to have a bigger Q&A, but I do want to pull people in. I feel like somebody's going right ahead.
Hi, I'm the outreach coordinator for Goodwill Central Texas. So we work with, you guys are all fascinating. I have like 100 questions. But let me go with the easy one that he just prompted. This has obviously been a very real topic in our town by something that passed and then get repealed. So let me ask it about as simple as possible, be this much room. If you were in charge, how would you have done it in this town in the recent past? Because it's been a real issue that's polarized people on all kinds of things. How would you have handled this right here in this town?
In charge of what?
So
I think he's talking about camping ban, repeal.
exactly.
And
So let me just provide some context to folks here, which is the city of Boston had these laws on the books from quite a few decades ago that outlawed certain actions like camping, sitting in line in public spaces, and our city council went ahead and repealed them. So essentially saying that now you couldn't, be camping, sitting in line in various parts of the city, and there was a lot of backlash to that. There can be a big conversation about what that looks like, and we will talk about that in the next theme. And one of the conversations that happened was it went to the ballot as an initiative, and our residents in the city of Austin voted and said they actually did not want people to be camping live or sitting in public spaces. And I think so that's what the reference is, and the idea is, how would you handle this sort of back and forth situation separately? Go ahead.
If I can add one piece, I think you framed it perfectly, but so it did pass the ballot, and whatever way you voted, to my knowledge, it's been less than a handful of any that it's actually been enforced since it passed. So it's been a very interesting thing to sit through it about the topic that we're talking about, right in my hometown.
so I do want to step in there, and and I'm not gonna speak to what I would have done because I wasn't with the city and it was policy decision, and we are enforcing. Before I talk about how enforcement is happening, let me just say that. So we have an ordinance, enforcement is happening. The expectation that enforcement is going to make homelessness disappear is fantasy, right? Will it decrease the size of encampments? Probably, right? The sort of accumulation of stuff, yep. Will people have to move around and get disconnected from services? Mhm. Yep, that's gonna happen. So all those things are happening. So initially, the APD went and enforced under all of the overpasses that were being serviced by public works departments where they were doing cleanups. So that was like set 40 sites. And then I think what we're dealing with now, and I think then there's a lot of frustration, we acknowledge that in the community about like, not only sort of, and I'm being a little bit, the expectation that this just, makes the problem go away, but there's an encampment in my community and I'm calling, et cetera, and it's not happening. There are hundreds of encampments in the community, and many of which have substantial accumulations of stuff. And so it's, we're first of all, I mean, my division, and this started before the election happened, sort of started an initiative that is way too small, which says we're going to focus on encampments where we see serious health and safety risks, and we're going to go and offer shelter and access to housing. And that's how we're going to try to move, clear encampments. But they are happening even in those, other locations. And we're talking about, 2 years of, there's a lot of stuff, right? And so it's just going to happen over time. So.
As someone on the, I'm not gonna say the other end, but part of the group of community troublemakers that called for the initial repeal of the original camping ban that was in place in Austin. I will say we pushed very hard, and I think it was a huge victory in Austin, a huge victory when council voted unanimously, or almost unanimously. I can't remember exactly how the vote was. Was it unanimous? No, it wasn't unanimous. But when we got council to vote to repeal the initial camping ban, and one of the things that we wanted to do to accomplish with that was to precisely make the problem visible again. It goes back to what I said earlier, that so much of the problem is an aesthetic concern for people. If they don't see it, they don't care about it. And so we wanted folks to be in a place, first of all, where they were safer, closer to the urban core, where they had the benefit of things like lighting at night to keep women safer from sexual assault on the street and stuff like that. We wanted them to be in a place where they were easier to find for the point in time count. We wanted them to be in a place where they're easier to access when you're trying to get them into encampments and services and all of that. And I think that, recently, all of you who have been following the news know that, city council committed $106 million of its ARPA money towards homelessness. The county committed $110 million. There's been a fundraising initiative with the private sector, with large foundations committing money. And that kind of momentum, I don't think would have existed if the problem had not been made visible to Austin. So at least on that front, repealing the camping ban was extremely important. Now, I will say that the return of the camping ban and the renewed criminalization of it has made our efforts, and has made the efforts of anyone trying to provide services to unhoused community exponentially harder. Because now folks you have to go looking for people in campsites that are ever more hidden and remote, which makes it less safe for people, less sanitary, less healthy. It worsens the problem in just about every way. And to put like a specific example on that, during the freeze last week, I approached a person who was under a little shelter they had built that had collapsed under the rain and ice. And this person was living under a tarp, trembling, needed help, was going through a mental health crisis as well. And I approached the person with gloves, a hat, you know, a warm meal, some support and supplies, and the person, you know, said, get away from me, get away from me. Every time you guys come and talk to me, you guys harass me and you guys made me move from under the overpass and you guys threatened to arrest me and if you want to arrest me, take me to jail. I was like, ma'am, I'm not a police officer. I don't look like a police officer. Like, get away. But like the trauma was there. And we realized that it was even just my voice as a male voice. This person had been harassed and told to move multiple times by male police officers. And this person thought that I was a police officer. They were going through mental health crisis. But think about how much harder it just became to approach this person and connect them to services and get them into shelter and get them support. Because every interaction this person has had with someone who has a voice that sounds like mine has been an antagonistic interaction with law enforcement. So, you know, I mean, I don't think anyone would give me the power to make choices about how this stuff happens in Austin, but I would continue to repeal the camping ban and allow folks to camp in places where they can be public and safe and better connected to resources, and then continue to make it a top priority for the city to increase its shelter capacity, increase its permanent supportive housing capacity, and to increase all of the, you know, rapid rehousing programs and all of that, so that we can connect these people to services and get them off the street as quickly as possible. But my fear is that because it has been criminalized and because it has been pushed out of the visible sphere again, that people will start to care less and less about the issue. I hope that's not the case.
Thank you all. So I think as we wrap up this sort of section, I don't want to go into too much because we will be talking about criminalization, public safety in our next theme, and I think that's a critical conversation to have. One thing I just want to mention to that point, right, is that it's not as simple as allowing people to camp or not camp, because if we're saying you cannot camp or you cannot lie and sit, we have to provide an alternative. And I remember this very frustrating conversation after the PAN Fest. I feel like JP, you were in that conversation again. I forget a few people, and folks were like, oh, well, we need to help people. Like, we need to go and tell them that camping is no longer legal. What do we tell them? Where can they go? And we're like, nowhere. The answer is no, there's nowhere for them to go. We can shuffle people from side to side to side. We can put them in culverts. We can send them down into the bushes and creeks. We can send them into the woods, but there is no place for them to go unless we can create it. And Diana can really speak to this, the system that we're trying to create here in Austin. And like I was saying, the HEAL initiative, which was part of the program, and other pieces on moving people to actual housing situations. If we do not have the capacity and the resources in our system to house people, well, we're just moving people from one place to another. That's why I didn't know to leave this on, and I won't leave it at that because I think there was
I want to come back to this.
it's a good conversation, an important conversation to have, but I'll leave it on more of a call, which was very organic and kind of emerged here, which was, I guess, as architects, designers, planners, students, practitioners, what's really important for us is to, you know, not be the people who create those stones of injustice, right? We don't want to be those people. We want to be the people that folks who are unhoused tell other people, we like, go talk to those people, because when they design for us, when they create housing for us, when they create spaces for us, those spaces are welcoming to us. So there's truly a call to action here. Thank you all so much. We are going to go into a coffee break here, and we'll be returning back in half an hour. So right around the corner, there will be coffee and there's space for all of us to have a loose conversation, and we'll be back here in half an hour. Thank you all very much. So again, thank you all for being here at this conversation. And we're just going to sort of continue and jump right into some of these deeper conversations. And you know, again, I thank the people who are joining us virtually, who are joining us through the YouTube live stream, and thank you all for being here. So really, we started talking about this as we were leaving in the first part of the session, but you know, we're going to bring in this conversation on racialization, criminalization, and public safety. So I'm going to go over again some sort of meaty questions, and y'all can dig into it. And now we're joined by Logan, so thank you, Logan, for being here. So how does the racialized aspect of homelessness play into designers and planners' involvement in the issue of homelessness? And you know, I wanted to give an example of the city of Boston, where only 8% of our population identifies as Black, but 27% of our unhoused neighbors identify as Black. And Joe, you started touching on this earlier, but how do such outcomes relate with the racialized aspects of planning, design, and policy? How are we involved in this? And how do issues of policing and criminalization intersect with this issue of homelessness? What are the racial implications of safety, policing, and defining criminal activities when it comes to homelessness? And lastly, how do we define public safety and understand that there are different perceptions of what this means? How do we distinguish between concerns around safety and public health from from various different aspects and perspectives, and how do we bring this into, how do we address the needs of those who are unhoused? And lastly, how does sort of this public safety conversation get weaponized often in conversations around homelessness? So that's a lot of things. Y'all can take some of this and I'll do follow-up questions. Anybody who wants to get us started.
Sure, I can get us started. We see the same data in the overall homeless population. Blacks make up 13% of our population, but 40% of the homeless population. So there's an overrepresentation, and we see the same overrepresentation with Native Americans, Pacific Islanders, those of Hispanic origin, as well as Asian. So there's a disproportionate representation of persons of color within our homeless system. And we know that a lot of that has to do with institutional and structural racism. And some of that institutional and structural racism actually originated in planning policy. Because even if you look at the history of zoning, we start with Baltimore in 1910, where they had zoning laws that specifically excluded Blacks from living in certain neighborhoods. But of course, we know as history went on, it got overturned in Buchanan. However, what we see today, and this is really the huge responsibility that you all has, particularly as planners, when it comes down to things like zoning, even though that specific zoning may not exist today, when you have things like exclusionary zoning, where, okay, you cannot build multifamily housing here. Most housing has to be single housing on large lots. That is another form that's excluding people who are low income, because multifamily housing is a lot more affordable. So when we talk about zoning and when we talk about the racialized aspect of homelessness, we really see that persons of color have been excluded from the housing market for years. And that's why we see the gaps in social inequities. That's why we see the gaps in home ownership between persons of color and white individuals. And so we really have to begin to look at the history and how we got here. And I'm going to say this, our country is in this huge debate about, okay, talking about the history of this country and the impact that it has had on persons of color, the impact that it has had on homelessness. And the thing about it, I often tell people, when you go to your doctor because you are sick, your doctor just doesn't do a diagnosis on what you're presenting with. But in order to solve your issue, the doctor asks you about your history. And you give your doctor your history in order to come up with a solution to the current problem. So when we look at the history of zoning, when we look at the history of planning in this country, we really have to recognize that it has created the inequities that we see. And then this is where you all can come in as future architects, designers, and planners, and really advocating for zoning policies that remove a lot of these regulatory barriers that still perpetuate these inequities.
Joe, there's a great book that I recommend to you guys. It's called The Housing Bias. It's written by Paul Boudreau, and it's a $100 paperback. Very expensive because it's weighty. But it deals with all the policies that have been written into law over time that have created these incredible housing biases that create a housing problem.
Yep.
And
another good book, The Color of Law by Richard Ross. Yeah, very good book. And that actually
slightly cheaper
goes into it'll even go into how decisions by the Supreme Court still upheld a lot of the racial discrimination in housing that we see today. It's also a good book, The Color of Law.
And to bring it closer to home, much closer to home, in Austin, not only did many of you have heard or will hear about, Austin's history of racial segregation. Austin also helped sort of pioneer racial segregation. And in many ways, Austin is kind of like a living Jim Crow city to this day. But, east of I-35, the famous region that was created as the Negro district, and a little south of that, was a district created where the Latino and Mexican American population was concentrated. These areas were denied services. Folks were like very deliberately pushed into these areas. They had water and other services cut off in other parts of the city, and they could only access those services if they lived in the Negro district. So that history still very much shapes Austin and the way Austin plays, the way that plays out. And then of course I have to talk about UT, because UT absolutely participated in and perpetuated the displacement of Black and African American communities, many of whom lived in regions close to what is now the campus area. And as UT expanded east, UT participated in the displacement of Black and POC communities in East Austin. And that is like a very real legacy of this institution that has to be acknowledged. And I think in order to move forward in a better direction, right, that past has to be reckoned with. And then on that note, there's also this question in Austin where you have, because of this this history of pushing people out and pushing and oh my God, sorry. This is not my day. This is not my day. So anyway, I think that's all I'm going to say for now, is that we need to acknowledge this history that comes very, very close to home, and how that plays out in so many of the decisions that we make.
It's interesting, in San Antonio, we have 8% of our population is Black. About 38%, 36% of our homeless population is Black. San Antonio is 64% Latino, and about 40% of our homeless population is Latino. So we actually are defying the numbers that you talked about, Joe, and that's interesting. We actually have, on a per capita basis, more Anglos who are homeless in San Antonio than Latinos. Also interesting to me that our homeless rate in San Antonio is about 1 per every, let me get this wrong, 10,000, and in Austin, you all are significantly higher than that. Laredo, which is 96% Hispanic, is 1 per every, I think it's 17,000. And it's a much poorer city. So this racial thing is a very interesting, and I think we have to get beyond just dividing up into categories and saying Black people represent this percentage, white people represent this percentage, and we need to dig deeper into what are the real issues in each community that are causing that to happen. Like, those statistics make me ask a lot of questions about the Latino community. And is it consistent, or does it have to do with homogeneity? Does it have to do with family and community? What are the drivers?
So, and one of the things that, we talk to communities such as that, who may not have that data that represent an overrepresentation of person of color. Okay, then look at your outcomes. Because one of the things that we found that even when a community has, let's say, more white people who are homeless than Blacks, when you look at their outcomes, who's accessing housing? They found that there's a disproportionate in terms of the whites are accessing housing at greater rates, a lot faster than their Black counterparts. And we really find that particularly with homeless youth who identify as LGBTQ that are of color. And they see their white counterparts, and what the data showed us is that the homeless youth of color are sent into transitional housing because they're perceived as needing life skills to work on their behaviors and how they socialize and how they interact, whereas their white counterparts are sent directly into permanent housing instead of transitional housing. So when we really began to dig in the data and look at the outcomes, we began to see that there was a lot of implicit bias in terms of how that intake worker, how that person who was doing the assessment interpreted the individual's behavior and the individual's interactions based on how they perceived certain people. And so we really want communities to also look at those outcomes.
Yeah, and I would have to look at it and say as well, I don't actually believe the statistic that there are fewer Latinos in San Antonio. I think that we have a culture of Latinos who double up, triple up in their families, and they're comfortable living in multi-generational housing situations. We don't have that same history in the Anglo community. And so it's a really interesting set of dynamics that I want to just challenge us to dig deeper and to ask ourselves, what are really the driving forces? And I don't think we can look at the data that is a resultant, or we can look at what's leading, but I don't think we have sliced through this in a way that we yet really understand the complete drivers. Race is an issue.
Yeah.
And I live in a Black neighborhood. My wife and I moved there 7 years ago. It was 70% vacant when we moved in, lots and houses, and we love the neighborhood. We love our neighbors. But I've also lived now in a place that has experienced systemic racism for a long time in the patterns that shape the community I live in. You know, why is it that all of the streets are one way coming into my neighborhood, except for one that goes out? That is a pattern of city planning that was based on racial redlining, profiling, that dates back to the 50s, but it still exists. Why is it that the police substation, where you have to check in as a sex offender every week, sits under the bridge at the major entrance to my neighborhood? And that every Black mom with her child has to walk by that substation from the bus station. That is racial inequity. That is systemic racism that is still in place in the communities that we live. And I'm not saying that the people in the city are racist in their policies today, but we haven't rooted those things out. And I think what I realize as a privileged white man living in that neighborhood is I see that neighborhood differently than my Black neighbors do. That they grew up there and they think that's just the way it is for everybody. But it's not. And I think we as designers have to bring that lens very carefully in conversations with people. My Black neighbor across the street is working on her second graduate degree. She's brilliant. I absolutely love her. She rents a very, very shabby home. And, you know, we're having conversations about her wanting to buy a house. And she's like, but I'm afraid to. I think I'm going to get taken advantage of. I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to get a mortgage. I don't know how to, because no one's, I mean, this is generational. No one in their family has ever owned a home. How do we come alongside people of color who have been disenfranchised and help change that dynamic, not just identify it? And I think we as architects have a role to play in that, and planners.
JP, I feel like you wanted to see something that I can see.
Yeah, well, it's just this exchange was great because it helped me remember the comment that I was going to make, and I'm
That's what
definitely.
we're here for.
You guys will all get to watch my brain slowly disintegrate on this panel. But I was just going to mention that I'm not going to risk the statistic because I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but most of Austin's unhoused population became homeless for the first time while living in Austin. And the map of where they became homeless tracks to the same map where we have that historic pattern of segregation. And in those neighborhoods where you have those historic patterns of segregation, what you see is a lot of low-income rental properties either being redeveloped or going offline or being purchased, and those folks moving out. So a lot of folks who are homeless in Austin, the majority, in fact, that homelessness can be traced almost directly to gentrification and to the fact that the communities they used to live in, they can no longer afford to live in. They lived in low income, naturally occurring affordable housing. There was nothing that protected that housing as affordable. It was on the market, it got purchased and redeveloped. So,
Yeah, but that's a tax policy problem. You know, this notion of gentrification, and I really want to challenge that. My neighbors, when I talk to them about the neighborhood, remember what it was like when they were a child, and how vibrant it was, and how there was a store on every corner, and how they rode their trikes in the streets. And they describe a neighborhood that is not the neighborhood we live in today. They don't want the neighborhood to stay the way it is. They don't want to get kicked out of the neighborhood, but they'd like to see it improve. The problem is we have a tax policy problem. We have a property tax problem in the state. That if the value of my property goes up, my taxes go up and I can't afford to live there anymore. That's what we need to fix. And we need to, I really believe we have.
Did you just say income tax?
I would absolutely would be for that. Absolutely, I would be for that. Or a consumption
Right.
tax, a sales tax would even be better, because if you spend money, you should pay tax.
Right.
But just because you own a property does not mean you should be taxed on it and taxed out of it. So we have got to change the narrative around this, or we're gonna lose this. We're gonna lose this argument every single time. And that's where we have got to enter into the political realm and start having conversations that will really make a difference.
And you're speaking to folks who own property, right? Which is, I'm talking about folks who never had a chance in day of owning property. They were renters in low-income apartments that got redeveloped. But you're right that that displacement takes place with property owners.
And
as well.
dependence on the property tax gets if you don't have homestead exemption, right? If you have a rental property,
Right.
right? So that tax gets passed directly through.
Right.
Unless we have a tax abatement for affordable housing to the renters. So naturally, if we're affording rentals, affordable rentals, you lose them. And that's, I actually think, a bigger driver of displacement than homeowners, which is also substantial.
It's both,
Right.
right? The taxation system is regressive. It hurts the people who have the least, and we need to fix that. And we need to improve the neighborhood at the same time, because the thing that drives me crazy as a designer, as an architect, is that we would settle for bad in order to keep property values down. That's a bad policy.
Yeah, I've definitely had some friends in the community suggesting like maybe we should trash things up a little bit to keep the property taxes down. I've heard folks make that kind of.
Maybe I shouldn't landscape
Yeah.
my yard so my property values don't go up.
Yeah, no, and that's right. And there has to be a way to make spaces better without displacing folks from those spaces.
Absolutely.
And right, and I do want to hear from Logan and Sarah from both of you as well, but I think this is really, you know, that question of essentially saying, the answer or the solution is not to say that we're not going to improve people's living conditions or allow people to have a poor quality of life because that is the only way to have an affordable quality of life. The question is, how can we improve people's quality of life while ensuring that they still get to maintain, their housing, continue to benefit from where they are? And I agree with you, it's a very complex issue, but sorry, Sarah and Logan, we definitely want to hear from you on this sort of larger theme around racialization as well.
Well, I think this panel said a lot of amazing things. I agree with a lot of it. Two small things came to mind for me on this that, let's see, number one, I think, several of you guys brought up, you can follow the history of neighborhoods back and just see communities disintegrating because of policy. And absolutely, it can be tied to generational wealth gaps, right? And, lack of, people are pushed out of neighborhoods into other places, and that has a direct correlation to home and shelter. But the other thing that does is it disintegrates like the social networks that existed in those neighborhoods, like especially in East Austin and other places like that, where you had like generations of that built-in social structure where multi-generational, where people had a home somewhere, they had a lot of people that would be step into that gap for them in times of need. And I do think like disintegrating a place where a social structure exists, like further disintegrates that social structure if you're dispersing that, amongst a lot of different neighborhoods or places, or moving it far outside of, where they can get quick connection to people that are in their life on a day-to-day basis. So I think it even goes beyond just the shelter or the house. And the second thing that I think a lot about is like, I didn't mean to be the maintenance person here, but like just it's such an interesting question. I think like how what the like life of houses is, like houses that are built in the 1920s or 30s that exist, and there's deferred maintenance for a long time because it is like really maintenance is expensive on houses that are poorly built, right? And it's really unsexy, like nobody wants to spend money on things like that, especially if you're like living paycheck to paycheck or in survival mode or whatever. Like you just cannot spend money on keeping up an old house that like needs a lot of stuff. And so I just think a lot about how like poor communities like do not have a lot of money to spend on like ensuring the longevity of their built environment. And what that does is it just like creates a community that's ripe for people with a lot of money coming in and saying like, we can just tear this all down, you know? And I wonder
Or the
if,
city condemns it.
yeah, I think that there's a lot of things. And I wonder if there are better mechanisms to care for structures if there wouldn't be such a quick pipeline to, you know, redevelopment by entities that are not in the neighborhood.
Well, I do want to hear from Logan. Sarah, you want to say, I did not have a maintenance person in my life, so I'm so glad now I have. Just expect emails and calls from me. So, Logan, please go ahead. Then we'll come to, come back to that.
Yeah, I wanted to piggyback off of what JP was talking about earlier with regards to transportation and how it's used as a tool in these sorts of issues. And it definitely has a history of being used as a tool for racial segregation. We see that in the use of eminent domain for constructing highways and larger roads, and how that's disproportionately taken place in historically Black and Latino communities. And kind of also in one fell swoop isolates them from any of the things they need economically to thrive. You have the need of a car to get anywhere. These larger roads demolish the use of the land for things that can be used as community markets or gardens, or really any of the infrastructure that's lacking, especially on the east side. If you go to the east side, it's a lot of residential, big lot size, big setbacks. These things destroy the ability for these people to have the economic basis for not being homeless. And yeah, that's like the biggest issue in terms of how we've been finding things transportation wise. And also, I think in gentrification, we need to talk about how it's a very tricky issue, because you kind of encounter the problems with the fundamental nature of property itself. Because when you think about housing, it's pretty basic. Everyone can acknowledge you need it. It's something that every single human needs. And yet there's still a market for it. And if you aren't able to participate in that market, you simply don't have a basic necessity. And so any solution to homelessness and the racialized aspect of homelessness, in my mind, would come from sidestepping the issue of property altogether and allocating these things on a more centralized federal level.
Dan, go ahead.
Been itching to talk about tenant screening criteria. Everyone's like, ooh. So, I mean,
What is it?
right. So, I mean, you know, we've talked all about, I mean, I talk about homelessness as like, it's multiple organ failure, all right? Like we've had so many systems that have failed people in so many ways. And in almost every single one of those systems, you know, the disproportionate impact on African Americans in particular, it plays. And our housing policies and zoning policies, et cetera. Here's the other thing we do with housing on a really practical happening today basis is that we build housing, rental housing, and particularly affordable rental housing. And I say that just because we have a little more influence over it in the public sphere, right? And we say, we're gonna build this beautiful rental housing. It's gonna be for really low income people, maybe people exiting homelessness, fantastic, we're all gonna feel really good about it. And all you gotta do is have a clean, never have interacted with the criminal justice system, right? And please also establish that you're sober and, you know, all these other things, right? And so for me, if you accept the premise, as I hope we all do, that our criminal justice system has disproportionately impacted communities of color, saying I'm gonna do affordable housing, but it's only for, the good folks, right, who don't have a record, is like saying, I'm establishing a hospital and I'm gonna serve everybody who's not feeling well so long as their blood pressure is under control and their BMI is a certain level, and also they're not hypertensive, right? And so it's, and this is, I mean, and I can say this with some passion because I've sort of been that person before. I came from the sort of general affordable housing world. And it wasn't until I started working in sort of housing people experiencing homelessness that it was just so blatant. That it was like, we can't call ourselves affordable housing developers. We can say, I've elected to serve this, because it makes me feel better. And here's the thing, that when we in supportive housing have looked back at the stability of people in housing, it's not, who's going to be a good tenant is not determined by their previous history, right? You still manage the property. If you have somebody who's behaving, on site in a way that's unsafe for other tenants, you've got to address it. But that's sort of like, oh, it's been 15 years since you've had a, XYZ, it's just not reflective of the reality of the community.
And we see that, here in Austin, not only do property managers and private landlords apply tenant screening criteria for low-income properties that have received tax subsidies, we also see that even with our local housing authority, which implements screening criteria for its housing choice voucher program, which is above and beyond the minimum requirements from HUD, right? So we go out of our way to say, well, no, we're going to actually screen out more folks. So there's folks on our coordinated assessment list that are getting skipped over for access to housing that would qualify because they can't get a voucher from our local housing authority, which imposes, extra screening criteria, including looking for things like a history of sex work or, a felony drug offense. And we know who has been disproportionately targeted by the war on drugs. So, I mean, these policies lead to where we're at. And just to go back to the property management piece, there is another issue, which is in Austin, a lot of our old rental properties, which have folks who are either exiting homelessness or are this close to becoming homeless. A lot of those properties get passed around a lot between property management companies that don't really want to do the maintenance that you were talking about, right? That kind of real structural maintenance that the property needs. So we get the famous lipstick on a pig. We get the rooms get repainted and, you fix things up a little bit. Rebrand it.
Terraces.
Yeah, the terraces, the whatever, the parlor at Oak Hill, whatever. And then you put it back on the market and then you run that property for a year until you realize that it's a nightmare and you pass it on to the next person and it's a hot potato. And we have so many properties like that in Austin. And sometimes even our policies to address homelessness and our rapid rehousing programs put money into the hands of landlords who perpetuate this kind of cycle of hot potato practices. So this goes back to your point, I think the fundamental question about, can we really solve this problem if we're thinking about housing as something that still has to be profitable at the end of the day? Like, can you make a profit and solve and provide stable, long-term, dignified housing for folks who are experiencing chronic homelessness? And I don't know if that's if we can. I think that we have to move beyond that, but we still look for solutions that try to work with the market that way and create that win-win situation. And I'm not opposed to folks, making a living, making money, but in that win-win situation, how often do the unhoused folks lose every time? So we have to think about these things.
And another question that comes along with the question of can you do it is, if you do it, will it be permanent? Because the market is always in flux. Things are not permanent in the market. You need a centralized force to accomplish these tasks and mandate that it maintains its existence.
Do you mind? I was just gonna say, I think, it might be going a little off on a side, but if you want to come back, we definitely can. I think something y'all are hitting on really sort of the systemic nature of the issue, right? Like even in terms of racialization of the systems that have created, like, and like you were saying, these screening criteria depend also on the fact that we have incarceration rates that are higher for people of color, particularly Black people. We have a foster care system where we're more likely to see children of color, more likely to see Black kids, and queer kids, like you're saying, right? And those systems then are producing these inequities, and they're being tied into our housing system, being tied into the way we address homelessness. So, this came up earlier. I do want to come back to this question of criminalization and public safety for who and how do we look at this? And it's sort of a broad conversation, but I would love for you all to, touch a little bit on that as well. And I know if somebody wants to take the lead.
Well, we already kind of talked about how it's been legally criminalized in Austin. Like, it's illegal basically to be homeless out on the street. Along with that, it's also become sort of intermixed with the racialization issue. So these communities are sort of facing the issue of being homelessness and being minority at the same time on the streets. And they have really no one to trust. And this issue of public safety is brought up as sort of a scapegoat almost, for saying that your opponent, someone who's advocating for say housing first or helping the homeless in general, is anti-public safety by saying that the camping ban should be not a thing. And so it makes the conversation sort of easy from their perspective. But when they say public safety, what they're really talking about is safety for their community and safety for their property downtown. And so you have to kind of figure out when they're using public safety in that way, which is usually the case.
And law enforcement in America is used to address every problem that we don't want to solve or don't know how to solve in any other way. Throw police at it, and that will be the answer. And it never works. And there's unhoused folks who live downtown. Police officers who patrol downtown know them very well, have picked them up a dozen times, don't have anywhere to take them, send them, they drive them to Del Seaton when they're in crisis, they take them to Integral Care, they take them here and there, and then that person ends up back on the street. And so they know these folks, and there's various levels of trauma in that relationship. And the unhoused folks know the police very well. In fact, they probably know the police better than almost anyone else in our city because they interact with police officers so consistently. But the police, in their most benign state, have nothing to offer the unhoused folks in terms of resources or help other than to drive them to an agency that will likely hand them a form to fill out, close the little glass window, and expect them, and if that person doesn't know how to answer a set of stock questions, that, and this goes back to the racial thing as well, because our assessments contain questions that are worded in a certain way that may be harder for certain people to understand than others, and harder for certain people to answer in a way that meets what the assessor or the person on the system end is looking for. So then that person gets overlooked, doesn't answer the right question, doesn't check the right box, can't be processed into the system, and then falls back on the street. And then the next moment they're in crisis, who are we sending to help? It's the police, because we've underinvested in every other service, and we've overinvested in police. And in Austin, APD receives currently over 40% of the city's general fund budget, right? So, and it's a growing thing. APD every year receives more money. So the tendency is for us the police budget balloons while every other budget is forced to shrink. And that was something we tried to address starting in 2020 with conversations about reimagining public safety. And unfortunately, that was blocked by the state. But at the end of the day, you can have your most well-intentioned police officer, but he's wearing a uniform that already carries trauma with it and already is a symbol of a kind of violence against the community. So even if that police officer is trying to help, that police officer oftentimes already triggers a traumatic response simply from the uniform, simply from that presence. And even if the officer can bring that person into their vehicle and take them somewhere, where is the officer going to take them? Because every other system has been underfunded, underbuilt, and so on. So it's just not an answer.
Yeah, and from the police officer I've spoken about it, they're as frustrated as we are, right? They're not equipped to do this. They don't have the resources. It's the wrong use of their time and our money, frankly. We haven't talked about the economics of homelessness, but it's a massive cost to our society to not care for the homeless. And, we need to actually start looking at the economics. I think, Joe, you talked about economic impact. There's an enormous economic impact of what we're doing, both in terms of how we're policing, how we're not caring for people. There's an enormous economic impact of a homeless person living on the street. If they're handcuffed to a police officer in the emergency room at the hospital, waiting 8 hours, that policeman's not doing what that policeman should be doing. And it just costs us a whole lot of money to not let that person actually get good care.
And that's why when we talk about the criminalization of homelessness, one of the things that we often advocate is that economic cost, in the sense that here we are creating public spaces, but in creating these public spaces, we are criminalizing certain behaviors for certain groups of people. And you mentioned how, it's hidden behind a veil of public safety. So you can't sleep here, it's an issue of public safety. But that ordinance that says you can't sleep here really isn't about just sleeping. It's about a particular group of people sleeping. If I sleep on the park bench, I'm fine. But if a homeless person sleeps on a park bench, then they're criminalized and they're arrested, or they're fined. So really looking at that economic impact and looking at public spaces. And when we're creating and we're designing public spaces, asking that question, who are we really designing this space for when we talk about the public? And at the federal level, we talk to communities about when you criminalize those activities that are typically seen amongst homeless individuals. Number one, understand that the role of law enforcement is simply to enforce the law. Police officers are not social workers. Right. And I often use Philadelphia as an example where they develop what they call the sidewalk behavioral ordinance. And so when we talk about partnerships and law enforcement working together with providers, the sidewalk ordinance says this: if you see a homeless person doing something that is considered breaking the law, you don't arrest or fine. You call outreach and you call the service providers and have them come and engage the homeless individual, so that that criminalization, that arrest isn't the first response. And then one of the other things, this last thing that I'll say, a lot of times when you're dealing with downtown districts or center city districts, you have panhandling, and a lot of the business owners, really in an uproar about the panhandling and the impact on their businesses. But Philadelphia took a similar approach in terms of building what they call the public space partnership, in which the Center City District came together with the homeless community and really developed an ordinance that looked at, okay, let the focus be on minimal law enforcement when we talk about ordinances that impact public spaces. And essentially what they did was they prioritized what law enforcement would act upon in terms of the most harmful activities. So if we're in a public space and you're getting mugged, but I'm sleeping on the bench, law enforcement needs to respond to you and not me. And it really created a community and an environment that really worked to decriminalize being homeless.
I'm curious, what does Austin spend on homelessness every year?
So our annual budget over the last 3 years or so, it's increased significantly, is around 65 million. And that is a combination of some federal funds in there. So about half operating budget, so services, and half that's capital, so bond money. We do spend more general fund money than most Texas cities.
So the reason I asked that is that, and my data is old because I haven't been able to get good new data. But when we were working on the bridge and Haven, the statistic we got in San Antonio and that's similar in Dallas was that every homeless person in the community was costing the taxpayers $50,000 a year without services, doing nothing. So in Austin, with 3,500 homeless, is about what you said?
Yeah,
That's $175 million a year that taxpayers are paying because that person's incarcerated, they're getting their medical care in the hospital, they're taking up police time. There's a better way to spend that money.
I mean, that's usually the number that, a similar number we use for chronically homeless, and why permanent supportive housing is, it's
It's
expensive. Well, yeah, it's expensive. You're essentially paying rent for a year and services, but you're still coming out ahead. The issue that many communities deal with is that the incentives are all squirrely, right? Because who's gonna spend money to address it? Well, usually it's the city. Who's, actually incurring most of the costs? It's spread out, central health, the county, state, et cetera. But yes, and I gotta tell you, like, when we first started talking about housing first in Texas, 15 years ago, which is what, that was not an easy conversation.
It's not today.
The cost benefit, it's not today, but it was a, it was a get run out of town conversation back then. Just say, let's talk about cost benefit. That's not my motivation. I don't think that should be our, fundamental motivation here, but we are spending the money. We are spending it today,
That's fine.
yeah.
Well, also I just have to say, like, there's other ways to fund things too, right? Like Austin is a very wealthy city and there's a lot of money in this city, and we can, the amount of money that it would take to house the amount of people we need to house is small in comparison to the amount of money that is in Austin, Texas. So I think that there are other resources that need to get tapped, and that's, most of what Mogul Loaf says is look for private funding, because there is a lot of resources in the city of Austin. So we want to make sure we're tapping all of that.
As it is in San Antonio, it's been
Yeah.
$100 million investment in Haven for Hope, from private money, not city money. You weren't waiting around for the government to do it.
JB, I'll give you the last word on this.
No, because then we started talking about the private money thing and I had a comment on that, but I'm afraid I'm gonna take us down a rabbit hole. So I'll let you go.
It's okay, if you want to go for dinner.
Well, no, all I was gonna say is I think once you start, I think it's fundamental in a city as wealthy as Austin to get the private sector on board and to get all of the local foundations, tech giants that are here contributing to the solution. I think that's fundamental. The challenge with the private funding, from my point of view, is to get funders to fund in such a way where they're coordinating, where it's not redundant. And there's certain things that funders love funding, usually because it's the shiny, very visible object. And all the funders want to fund that one thing. And there are multiple parts to the system that are hidden that are extremely important that funders often don't fund, right? So then I think the big challenge with private funding is somehow getting the private funders to coordinate, to talk to each other, to coordinate with the public sector enough to fund the system in a way that you're actually doing systems change, or else you're just doing charity, and charity doesn't get us out of this fix.
But the government hasn't exactly done a great job of coordinating either.
No, that's fair. That's why that's why some of us troublemakers are out here banging on pots and stuff.
Okay, I think JB, that tees us up perfectly for our next theme. We're really jumping into the idea of like, how do we support this demand for unconditional and humane permanent housing? Again, folks, you can look at the back of our glossary terms of what we mean by permanent supportive housing, because I think that's been talked about. We've talked about a lot of different things. But I think really we want to keep it more broad and really talk about the demand for unconditional and humane permanent housing. And thank you, Logan. And we're going to be joined by Luda, who's going to be part of this conversation. I'll sort of start digging into the questions here. But one, what does unconditional and humane permanent housing for all look like? I think that's something that y'all sort of alluded to, but it might be good to dig into. Then how do we ensure that the unhoused have a voice and agency in shaping the efforts to address homelessness? What are some examples of successful collaborations that they have yielded, that have yielded longer term results? in addressing homelessness, and how can universities, schools of design and planning, folks like us, how can we engage in these collaborations? And lastly, how does the public, nonprofit, and private sector, as y'all are sort of bringing up, engage effectively in ensuring that there's continued support to carry out these long-term programs and policies, rather than focusing on immediate responses that might be politically motivated. So a lot of things again to throw out here, and hopefully y'all can pick on it at these, and anyone can get us started here.
Sure. One of the big things that I'll say, if we're talking about unconditional housing and what that looks like, my biggest thing is, first and foremost, it has to be looked at from a perspective that housing is a right. Housing is a basic human right. Right now, housing is perceived as something you deserve. And because it's perceived as something you deserve, when we talk about unconditional permanent housing, you have to deserve the housing. So that means you have to get your substance issue in order. You have to get your mental health issue in order. You have to get all of these other issues in order to deserve housing. And then once you get those issues in order, then you can go into housing. But when we talk about that unconditional housing, access to permanent housing that is not based upon condition, we're really talking about reframing how we look at housing. And we're looking at housing as a right. And it was mentioned in the first part of this discussion, a lot of that perception around housing being something that you deserve really has its roots in our country's history of social welfare policy. Our country's history of social welfare policy started out with the worthy poor versus the unworthy poor. So we had social services and we had policies to help individuals. However, the only people who had access to that were those who were considered the worthy poor, meaning you were a widow, your husband died, or you were an orphan. In other words, you were poor because of a circumstance beyond you. Whereas the unworthy poor were viewed as being poor because of a moral flaw. And therefore, because of that moral flaw, you then have to earn the right to housing, earn the right to other social services. So unconditional housing really starts with looking at housing as a right and not something that you have to earn or you have to deserve. And I'll say this real quick, in the region that I work in and where I do my work, I work with a lot of people in the faith-based community. And there is that huge perception within the faith-based community that, housing first is not where it is. And, people have to, get their issues in order. But I often tell people, if you look at the same gospel, that they preach, and I talk to people all the time, and the reason why I'm saying this is because there is that huge perception, that you have to earn housing. And often when I'm speaking to communities of faith, and I often use the analogy that you have a concept of grace, that you have God's unconditional love, or you have God's unconditional favor, meaning God loves you regardless of what you've done. But when it comes down to homeless people, you don't have an unconditional right for housing for homeless people. They have to do something to earn it or do something to deserve it. So one of the biggest barriers is that perception and looking at housing as a right.
And, I think in order to get there, for one, there's a building challenge. We need to build a lot more housing and possibly acquire some properties and convert them into permanent supportive housing, but we need unit capacity that does not exist in the system right now. And I'm sure that Diana can speak to that a lot more. But if the problem is what Diana calls multiple organ failure, which I think is very apt, then the solution has to be a solution that is flexible. And that is, if you recognize that there is no such thing as a kind of standardized one size fits all unhoused person, that the unhoused community is extremely diverse, that every person has a completely different story, background, set of needs, then the response to that has to be a response that meets people where they're at. And it can't be a one size fits all solution. If we invest in all triangles for everyone, then all the triangles will fit, but that will be about 10% of the population. So we have to have a menu of different interventions and approaches. So there will be folks that will want to live in a more peaceful, quiet community removed from the city. And there will be folks who want to live closer to the urban core so they can access jobs and opportunities and resources. And there will be folks who will want more privacy, and there will be folks who want more community. And so all of those different needs, every person will have their own needs, and we have to meet them exactly where they're at and walk with them to where they need to be, as opposed to saying, look, this is the one intervention we have. You know, I was joking about it with a friend of mine. It's like being the caterer for the National Convention of People with Food Allergies and bringing one dish to feed everyone, right? And that's all too often what our kind of housing interventions look like for homelessness. It's like, well, we have this one thing for you, and it's an incredibly diverse population.
And that's where the voices of the homeless come into play. You know, if we look at it even from a data perspective, you're a data geek like me, you know, quantitative data will tell you how many affordable housing units you need, but that qualitative data will tell you the type of housing that you need. And you're only going to get that qualitative data by speaking to the people and understanding what type of housing is it that you want. And so when you have that combination of that quantitative analysis with that qualitative analysis that involves the voices of people who are experiencing homelessness, then you can develop appropriate housing and give them choice in terms of the housing that is available to them.
And
Well, first of all, I'm stealing the metaphor that you just gave, JP, the food allergy metaphor. Okay, yes, lifting that for sure. I want to talk a little bit about the question about incorporating the voice of people with expertise into the work. Because y'all, I've been getting schooled. I mean, I just have to say, like, I had a really long way to come, I think. And for many, many years, you know, I think we have certainly valued the voice of the service providers who have deep experience and like very important feedback. And there was sort of and you should have like one person maybe on your board, or you should have you know, there would be this little sort of tokenism. And so one of the things, and the things that, and I'm very grateful for the folks who have worked so hard on this, including AJC, but others, is that we have what we refer to a leadership council here in the community. So we had sort of a governing board historically, and it mostly consisted of the service providers, right, who did this work. And this year, our local coalition, which sort of supports that board, essentially blew it up, right? And said, okay, we're, you know, clean slate. We're reconstituting this, still has service providers on it, but it has to have at least 12 or 13 members. It's got to have at least 3 people on it that have lived experience of homelessness. It's got to have equity advocates, and our committees also have to have people experiencing homelessness. And so that's great, and it's really important. The other thing is, you gotta pay people to do the work. Because if we think about it, like when we ask people to come into most of us who sit on those groups, we have a salary, right?
Yeah, pizza is not the pay.
Correct. And when we, you know, invite other folks into our spaces that aren't normally in the spaces to give us their expertise, we call those people consultants. And we're still struggling with this, guys. Like, we have not figured out exactly how we're going to do this, etc. But I think it is a fundamental shift to say, if we truly value people's input, we're going to pay them for it, right? So that's a big piece.
Yeah, you know, go.
Well, I was gonna say, yeah, we're also thinking a lot about that too. So yeah, one of my big goals at the village is to bring our current neighbors into a lot of the design choices that we make going forward. Like, we are actively creating the place as we live there, and as we live there, the place changes, right? And we want people to be actively involved in their own, like, the creation of their own spaces. You know, we did we've been building out phase 2 for a couple of years, and we, on phase 1, had a bunch of fancy architects from all over Austin design homes for, you know, formerly homeless people, but they did so without actually talking to anybody that was currently homeless. And so when we started phase 2, we really wanted to get people involved, and so we basically paired existing phase one neighbors. And we gave them free rent for several months and some other kind of incentives and paired them with an architect, and then they collaboratively designed a house together as part of that process. And, you know, that was like a really interesting experience. And one of the cool things that came out of it was like, everybody learned a lot about each other. And even like our neighbors that went through that process, like they are even like more experts now on design of homes in the community that we live in. And so like we're working on a consultant program right now where we like pay them for their expertise moving forward, just as we would pay any design consultant for anything we do. So yeah, we're learning a lot about that too. I also just want to agree with what everybody said earlier, which is that I think like when you think about like fostering a sense of permanence, a lot of you guys identified the necessity of choice. Like there has to be some choice that you make. And I think it helps me, like the question said, you know, what was it? Humane housing for all. Yeah. And I mean, for all part's very interesting, right? Because like, what does that look like for any of us in here, right? Like when we think about where we want to live in a permanent way, I think even though maybe a lot of us are not having to go through some kind of temporary housing scenario where we're like kicked out after a certain amount of months or something, I think we've all probably like experienced living in places that felt temporary or that felt like we weren't going to root or things like that. And I think that we can learn a lot from the way that we think about where we want to live, right? Like why is somebody that has experienced homelessness like not able to use the same tools for deciding where they would want to live, you know, or be able to root in a place or be able to choose a place where they can, whatever it is they want to choose, it like form relationships with people around them, or it's close to a thing that they like to go to a lot, or it's close to some green space, or it has a nice view or whatever. Like there's a lot of that stuff is like kind of nuanced into like what makes something feel permanent. Just because there's no policy that says you have to vacate this after a certain amount of time doesn't mean that somebody's going to feel like they can live there forever, you know? And I mean, I do like to kind of throw this out there. It's just like something that I think that we are housing for a specific type of person that's experienced homelessness, but I would say that like we talk about permanence a lot because a lot of the people that live in the village like truly do not have other family. Again, not true for everybody that's experienced homelessness, but if you choose to and you live at the village, you can do life documents with us, meaning that we are now kind of responsible for you even in death. And so you can be interred and at the village and we memorialize you and your name is on it. And, you know, we host a whole celebration of your life. And I think that was like a hugely important part for us in saying like, this is a permanent place. Like not only can you stay here for the rest of your life if you choose to, but like we even like memorialize you past that. And I think that's been really powerful for people that have not had connections or thought, you know, if you're living on the streets currently and you pass away, you're thrown into emergency grade. There's nobody to care for you after that. And so anyway, we talk a lot about like how do we foster a sense of permanence and making people feel like they can stay here. This is their place.
Rick, I feel like you were gonna say something. You go ahead. And then we'll go to Ludo. Go ahead, Rick.
No.
Rick will wait for you. You go ahead and then we'll.
Okay. I'm wrestling with this thought. Putting a person in a house is not the end state. It's a first state, but it is a belief that their life has infinite value and that they have something important to contribute to us as people, as a community, as a society. And so I think it's really important that we don't just, quote, meet their need by putting them in a house of their choice, but that we invite them into being a part of a community, as you all are doing, where they get to do important work. We all, like, I get a lot of satisfaction out of knowing that what I'm doing makes a difference in someone's life. And so I think this is always a really slippery slope because we don't want to end up warehousing people just because we put them in a house and we feel good about what we did. But we want to empower them through giving them an opportunity to reshape their own life, to be empowered to make decisions for their own life, to be given agency in the world around them. And so I think as we do this, we have to be super careful about, well, I solved that problem. I put that person to a slot that they liked. And they stayed there for the rest of their life, and they never felt like they did anything of significance. One of the things that I know from talking with the homeless people in the places that we design is that the single biggest differentiator in their success in moving into independence and feeling like they have agency is having a vision for the future of their life. They have no vision, then they will not succeed. And it doesn't matter what we give them. And so I think we need to be continuing to challenge ourselves around what is the next state. If we could solve this problem of people being on the street and they're in a home, what's that leading to?
Lily, you want to go ahead?
I just wanted to thank everybody for coming and coming to the question of how universities are involved in this question, this discussion. Yeah, thank you so much for this panel. I think for the student representative, it's very important for us to hear. And as a person who is about to enter urban design profession, it's very important to find kind of your own stance in it, your own voice, and it is a constant discussion. How, as an urban designer, you know, master plans and things, you know, kind of avoid gentrification, kind of think of affordability, think of also of housing, like you mentioned, housing as a human right, housing, not just another commodity, but something that the protection that you need, your own shelter. Yeah, so I would really like to hear your stance on this, how the advice that you can give to a new urban designer.
And I'm totally gonna second what Lula is saying, right? Like, I would be remiss if I did not ask y'all to really weigh in on this question of how can we, right, like folks in the school, this university, you know, folks who are coming into the design practice or planning practice, how can we collaborate? Like, what are these collaborations and ways for us to be a part of this work in a meaningful way? And I would love to just hear y'all thoughts on it along with Lula.
There has to be that collaboration with the local community. You know, when you're talking about an institution and you guys are part of students that are part of the institution, and of course, institutions want to grow. They want to grow so that they can enhance your educational experience. That growth might look like new dorms, that growth in what you're seeing with a lot of universities, retail space, etc. And you really have to come together and develop that growth with the community so that you don't end up gentrifying the community. The University of Pennsylvania is a perfect example of that, to the extent where they sought to grow the university, but there was no community involvement. There was no community input. And when I talk about community involvement, I'm not just talking about the nonprofits that are in the communities, but the actual residents that live in those communities. And so what ended up happening was, you know, they had a choice where they could either expand west or they could expand east. And they had to agree based on, you know, the community that we were no longer going to go past what is 40th Street in Philadelphia, but we could only develop towards the river. And so when we talk about that collaboration, it's really the institution working with the community in order to develop that community so that it benefits everyone. And another perfect example, this is the last thing that I'll say, you know, Penn wanted to get involved in education and wanted to build an elementary school for the community. And of course, this school would enhance the lives of youth, etc. And so Penn builds this school, but they built it without the community's input. And you want to know what ended up happening? The rental homes that were around that school are now worth $2 million. And then when the zoning was designed in terms of what catchment area would be designed for that school, guess what? It went zigzag all around the local community. And so really as an institution, coming together with the local community, and then you as students, making sure that you're talking to the administration and you're advocating to the administration that we have to involve the community in our planning as an institution, as we expand and as we grow.
Small footnote, UT should absolutely use the land it has currently to build a lot more housing for its students, at least for its own students. UT has lots of land on campus and there could be a whole lot more student housing. Just saying, since you guys gave me the microphone. But also to go back to the broader question about planning, all too often planning is this top-down exercise. The very word master plan contains the word master in it, right? So it implies this kind of godlike position above the community that is dictating things. And there's real pushback to that because it's like, you know, inviting all the fancy architects to come in and design homes for the unhoused, but then not hearing from the unhoused about what they need. And all too often that's how planning happens. And so it almost acquires a bad connotation. The word planning and planner almost becomes kind of a loaded word in the community. Like, oh, here come those same people that made all of these arbitrary decisions throughout history and decided, you know, that there would be a highway here, that there wouldn't be a highway here, that we would get moved over this way and that this would happen and that would happen. So I think that, you know, I appreciate the fact that there's much more interest now in community engagement and all of that. And I think that that's a great place to start, is to reject a kind of paradigm that thinks of planning as this top-down practice where you're just, you know, imposing your abstract vision onto a complex reality, and instead think of planning as something that can be collaborating with people in the community to solve their real problems. And think about that. And the only other thing I'm going to say is that I think all planners face, especially in Austin, I'll just talk about Austin, they're going to face this question about the NIMBYism, about the not in my backyard attitude, which is very, very prevalent in Austin. And it, you know, impacts all of these conversations that we're having. You know, this really intense resistance to any kind of new affordable housing development, especially, oh, don't even get me started on anything that would look like shelter or permanent supportive housing or anything like that. And being able to have conversations that allow for some nuance there, and that introduce the concept of change and the need for change, and the fact that if we inherited the city that has a fundamental like Jim Crow design to it, how can we move away from that and not just plan in a way that perpetuates and that reinforces that kind of design? But doing that, moving away from that, means being able to sort of confront loud and vocal opposition sometimes from the most affluent and powerful neighborhoods in your city. So that is, like, I think, kind of one of the major kind of moral challenges that anyone working in planning today has, is how do you undo that legacy of segregation and then create a space for the community to heal? Yeah.
I think that we have all said this a lot up here, but I do think that being like intentionally proximate to the people that you're trying to serve or design for is extremely important. And I mean that in a way where it's like there's a you know, we can get quantitative data from surveys or things like that, but what I mean by this is like develop relationships with people that are really different than you, or people that have experienced different things than you, and get messy with them. And it's costly to get into a relationship with people that might be difficult or might be very different than you, or might see things completely different than you. And I think that that's obviously helpful in a lot of what we talked about, which is like find people that have expertise about this and learn from them and listen to them. But I think it's also just helpful for architects to just like know how to work with people, like know how to work with people that are different than you, know how to read people, know how to get the right people in the room. And I think sometimes we can get so focused on the built thing that we like don't see all of the networks of people that are involved in this. And I think that that's something that probably designers can do a better job of doing. That also kind of makes me think about thought I had while we were talking about kind of the safety discussion, which is that I think I actually am like really encouraged by sort of like the generation of probably many of you that are in school right now that are sort of developing like a desire to kind of be in relationship with people that are very different than you. I think that y'all are probably doing a much better job of that than previous generations did. I think that we're able to sort of like understand people where we're at a little bit better, kind of understand that there are like a lot of externalities involved in like how we all show up to things. And I think also seeing people that are different from us as sort of like assets to whatever it is that we're doing. I think a lot about how like oftentimes we talked a lot about like local affordable housing providers, especially these kind of like, you know, junky apartment complex running property managers. I think oftentimes we're just trying to like carve out units, like carve out affordable housing units, like, you know, figure out a way, you know, if you're a real estate developer, you got to get that, you know, required minimum amount of affordable units, or, you know, how can we do the bare minimum? How can we put up with this difficult person that's going to be in this environment? And I feel like, can we flip that and be like, there's just like so much richness in creating community with people that have had like a whole range of experiences, you know, that are probably a lot better than we are at like being themselves, being vulnerable, expressing what their needs are, you know, working through some conflict and not just closing the door and flipping forever. I mean, there's just a lot of richness, I think, especially in my experience of people that have experienced homelessness in particular. And like, can we find ways to actually like build and like create, like, or make them the roots of our communities instead of just seeing them as something that we're like carving out space for.
You know, or that we're fixing.
Yeah, or that.
I mean, you know, it's not our job to fix somebody by being an architect or a planner. I would agree, a common theme for what I'm hearing, and it's certainly for me, is you have to be willing to get uncomfortable. You know, you have to be willing to put yourself in places where it's just not comfortable either. I am uncomfortable often in my neighborhood. I'm a minority. Well, you know what? That helps me understand how my Black neighbors feel when they are in a white neighborhood. That's actually really helpful to me. I realize that some of the things I do, just because of how I was raised, my neighbors don't get. And then they start telling me about it. And I'm like, oh, wow, I never realized I did that. And then be willing, as you're uncomfortable, to step in. And particularly as a student, I think you have some abilities to do things that you won't have when you get out. And you have some abilities as a part of a university to convene a panel like this that does not happen out in the rest of the world. Probably couldn't, because there'd be all kinds of other dynamics. So keep doing this, keep inviting conversation, keep welcoming debate among yourselves. I mean, we've said some things today where we disagree with one another. Man, I really respect where everybody on this panel is coming from, and I'm learning so much in my own way of thinking. So take advantage of that. You've got these few years to be around people who may not look like you, came from different places. Get real with each other, and then maybe together decide you're going to go tackle some small thing that you can do in the community. You know, our office has decided over the years that we're going to take on different things that we see in the community and see if we can make a difference. And it might literally be they're building a new street in the poor neighborhood next door, and there's no sidewalks, there's no street trees, and there's no street lighting. Does not meet city codes, but because they're poor, the city thinks they can get away with it. Well, guess what? We step in and we go, no, you can't. That's not what this street's going to be. And we cause problems like JP does. Or we actually built a van with pop-up sides that we could go and do mobile design work sessions with the community. And we would just go into a neighborhood and say, what do you need? Let's talk about this park. What would you like it to be? And then we began to advocate with the city about, well, this park needs to change, and this is why, and this is where it should come. And we got that onto the bond issue. Or we began to talk about, why is this street like this? This is the way the street should be. we held a little design competition and invited people from all over the city to redesign the street, whether they were an architect or not. Came up with some brilliant ideas. And we're getting the street completely redone until the governor stepped in and said we couldn't. That's another story. But as students, you can do that kind of thing in ways that we actually can't. And I would encourage you to take advantage of the power you have in this unique place you find yourselves.
And did you want to?
I guess, I'm thinking, how many of you guys are architecture students versus planning students? Okay. Oh.
We also have some landscape students.
Okay, yeah, awesome, awesome. Just trying to get a sense of, I think JP is speaking a bit about, the opposition that we face often, almost always, right? And so you're gonna be looked to as experts in your field, right? Whatever that is, whether that's through design, you're representing the deal. Often if you're at an architectural firm, that firm is also working through the zoning, process, et cetera. Many an affordable housing deal or community facility has died on a perceived technicality, right? And so, oops, our zoning policy wasn't quite clear and it had to go to the zoning commission and it just didn't quite make it. And so there's a lot of attrition of deals. And so I think understanding that those process pieces are really important because that's where we lose so much. And that so clearing the paths for projects, encouraging decision makers to have policies that intentionally say, we're not gonna kill these deals unless XYZ, right? We're gonna be we have a new policy called Affordability Unlocked in Austin, which probably doesn't, the planners are gonna tell me whether this really solves everything, but I mean, in terms of our zoning and entitlements, has made it so much easier. So that, because you have a lot of affordable housing developers who look at a property and go, I gotta rezone it, forget it.
Yeah.
Like, I can't afford to invest the time in this project, so we're gonna leave. So my point is, you're bringing technical skill and advice to decision makers that has real impact, right? Even though you might be advising on a technical piece of the work. And so being really intentional about building a system where we're not sort of going, oops, well, that deal couldn't quite make it. So I think just using this, we talked a lot about big ideas and, y'all are not gonna be both design professionals and go fix the Medicaid program probably, right? So thinking about how within your sphere of influence, you can affect change.
And, just a really quick comment on that, and I'm not gonna get into talking about the planning commission, because that would be, I'm getting ready to step down from the planning commission soon, but I will say a lot of these conversations that are had all too often just completely ignore the human aspect of it. So for instance, a debate about whether or not a building should be 60 feet or 80 feet, and the neighborhood coming out in strong opposition to 60 feet or 80 feet. But if that conversation were translated to, a difference in 25 units of affordable housing, that's 25 lives that could be changed by having a place to live. It's no longer a debate about height. It's now a debate about real human lives and access to opportunity. And it's so important to bring the conversation back to that place. And it's very easy for the conversation to get away from that place, if it ever was at that place to begin with. So I just wanted to say that.
I want to build on that because I think it's been a real issue in our profession. So we have measured, we talked about this earlier, we have measured our impact on the environment, on the planet. And we have lots of ways we do that. And we're really proud of ourselves for doing buildings that reduce energy consumption. And if you look at the whole thing, we're probably not doing such a good job. But we have at least paid attention to that, and good, we should. But we have been very poor at saying, we're going to pay attention to human outcomes. And, you know, as a result of that, I would challenge all of us, if we want to really be designers for making a difference in the world, you have to look at all of it. And at Overland, we created a measuring system we called the human handprint, just for that reason, because we didn't want to just be looking at sustainability and stewardship, but we want to look at all of the aspects. And for us, it's about aspiration. Why are we doing this project? You need to understand that before you get started. The middle finger is provocation.
Yes, it is.
Or inspiration. You know, I mean, we ought to be provoking change. We ought to be inspiring people to think differently. And if we're not, we shouldn't be doing it. You know, the ring finger is relationships. There are a whole series of relationships that need to be maintained in every single project we do, including the people who participate and experience our buildings. Sarah talked a lot about that. The pinky is the pinky promise we make to the earth and one another. It's stewardship. We got to do that. And the thumb is well-being. How are we doing? Have we created a place of human flourishing? And what we do in our office is we measure everything on those 5 digits. We set metrics at the beginning of every project that says, have we hit the key performance indicators? And then we do a post-occupancy evaluation to say, did the project achieve those things? It never does fully, but at least we know what we're aiming to do. So if we're designing a homeless center and we know that the goal is to house this many people, have them be able to live independently within X amount of time, we can look and say, how did we do? And frankly, that's more important than how many BTUs it used.
Will you repeat the 5 quickly?
Aspiration. Where are we going? Point the way.
Yeah.
Why are we doing this? Middle finger, inspiration or provocation. Okay.
I'll remember that one.
The ring finger, relationships. The little finger is stewardship. And the thumb is well-being. They're really easy to remember because they're related to the digit. And we take every single project through that lens and everyone knows it. And our clients get through, we're like, we're the Human Handprint Project. You haven't talked about this lately. And that holds us accountable.
It would be so interesting to think about like what policy could exist that uses that, right? Like, does a developer have to prove that they can meet those requirements in order to build?
We had a conversation in Laredo yesterday with the Consul General and we laid out sort of the digits. And at the end, she was like, I want to know that not just the economic impact. She said, I want to know the impact on all 5 digits. That's how we're going to measure success.
So, you know, we're gonna open it up to questions very soon. Before we wrap up, I do want to build on, I think, 2 things I heard. So one, I serve on the planning commission with JP, who's gonna leave me alone there. I'm very upset right now.
Bless you all for doing that. That's tough work.
But I think one thing that I think designers and, you know, landscape artists and a lot of people can help us with is a lot of these kind of questions come up, right? Like, oh, well, we don't want to see a massive block. And it's like, well, there's design ways of solving that. We don't want to see trash and there's designing criteria on screening, right? Like architects and designers have been able to really problem solve so many of these things in our built environment that people, you know, rightfully, sometimes not so rightfully, are upset about or concerned about. And there's ways of resolving that. I think there's a amazing brain trust here among the faculty, researchers, students, and that's critical to shaping some of that conversation, like JP was saying, in saying, yeah, like having multifamily housing or having supportive housing near you is not gonna be some eyesore. There is design, there is values that are put into it, like what you're saying, these values that go into the work that we're trying to do. And the last thing I'll just say, I think, Dana, you were pretty much saying the same thing, which is we all have a lot of voice here in this community, in this city, right? Like a lot of us may not live here or come from here or stay here forever, but while we're here, we have responsibility to go outside of our university walls and to engage in these important conversations that are happening. And I see that all the time in so many of our students and faculty who are doing amazing work. And I think just encouraging everybody to continue doing that, I think is a great thing that I can say. So we'll open up for questions. And if y'all don't have any, I have a bunch. But go right ahead.
try to squeeze in 2 questions in one a little bit.
Hold on a second, I think I'm gonna give you the
Did you
mic.
do the mic dance?
Yes.
All right, thank you. I'm gonna try to squeeze 2 questions into one if I can. One is that if all of you got to wave your respective wands, magic wands today and eliminated took every unhoused person off of the street and put them into a safe and permanent housing solution tonight, then tomorrow we would still wake up in a city that is drastically expensive and getting more so. I mean, Austin is becoming more economically segregated, more racially segregated. I think the long-term effects of what we're looking at are more like San Francisco than the old Austin that people still talk about, but that's not really a reality anymore. So I'd be really interested to hear y'all's thoughts on doing this kind of work under that kind of situation, and really what the long-term future is when we're dealing with these market forces that were spoken to earlier, in a market situation that is going to, keep taking and keep generating profit, and that is already excluding a lot of people that are at the lower end of the income level. You don't have to be on the streets to be housing insecure, right? There are probably people in this room that are having issue paying their rent. There's UT staff that is having issue paying their rent. So I'd be really interested to hear what y'all think about the future there. And then kind of tying into that is kind of the legacy of design and architecture in Austin in the last 10 years, because we spoke a little bit about East Austin and the Black community that is not really physically intact in a lot of places, right? That community has really been decimated by gentrification, in the sense that the people that used to live there are largely not living there anymore. And the people that are still there are really kind of holding on to with their nails. And I think the destruction, or at least the physical changes that have been wrought in those communities, are really tied into the work, into design and planning work too, right? So these big boxy houses that are meant to maximize property space, those are design interventions as well. And so I'd be really curious, not to point the finger at anybody, but I'd be really interested to hear about what y'all's thoughts are on that going forward, and how that changes, or if there's a mechanism to use these tools that have also wrought a lot of destruction, right? To use them for positive change. So I hope that's not too much. Thanks a lot.
I think you asked us if we could completely
Fix everything?
redesign Austin into a just and inclusive space.
It's interesting. I heard a presentation just last week. Property values in Austin went up. Do you all know what the percentage was last year? 41% in 1 year. In my city, San Antonio, it was about 26%. That's crazy. I also heard a speaker recently talk about this issue of affordability, and they showed some really interesting statistics, which is the cost of building a house or building housing has gone up at about 2 or 3% per year, and it's been steady pretty much forever. We don't have a housing problem, we have a land problem. Cost of land has just absolutely skyrocketed. And so a big part of the problem gets to who owns the land. And I think somebody actually spoke about this earlier, at least Logan, I think you were talking about this. And we have a whole population of people who were kept out of land ownership. Right. So if you were a Black person in America, you couldn't buy land. You couldn't buy land in my neighborhood where I live until 1956 if you were Black. I happened to live in the first home ever owned by a Black man in the neighborhood, and he purchased it in 1935, and I don't know how, but he probably hid the color of his skin in order to get the home, he and his Latina wife. So one of the things I've been hypothesizing about is, could we create ways that we could incentivize people to be able to own land who historically have been kept out of it? Meaning, Perhaps it's through lower interest rates or grant programs or something that allows us to diversify land holdings. I don't think we're going to change the system of land ownership in America. We're not going to go back to a Native American ideal of no one owns land because it's too entrenched in our culture and our economy. It's a major, major driver of economy. But we have to get other people into the land ownership game if we're going to create equity. And if we do that, then we'll start dealing with issues of generational wealth, which is actually really important. Like some of my poorer Black friends, if I asked them what would you really like, they would like, I would like generational wealth. I would like my kids to not grow up in the way that I did. So we're going to have to deal with land ownership. And that would be one of the things I would do is start figuring out a way to be more equitable in that.
This might be one of those areas where I don't want to say it's a disagreement. I think it's more like ownership is a really fascinating concept, right? And there's lots of ways to think about ownership. And ownership is important. It's autonomy over your space and some amount of control. Now, this idea that your home ownership is your wealth accumulation mechanism, and that is your strategy for building wealth, that was kind of sold to the American public in the post-war era, and everyone has kind of gone with it, or at least there was a generation that went with it. I honestly, my generation is not.
And I'm really saying land ownership.
Yeah, land ownership. Yeah, well, land ownership, but this, I think the tension it creates is that the very process that allows people to accumulate wealth through the land that they own also drives their own displacement from that land. Right, and there were, and there still are, lots of Black home and landowners in East Austin. There were many more, but as those values increased, they were, this is the famous, you're land rich, but you're equity poor. You don't have actual spending cash, but you sit on a piece of land that's worth a lot of money. And because of segregation and everything else, there is that connection, that racial factor is always playing into the way land is valued in the United States. So that tension is there. So thinking about ways to allow people to own land without that force that drives their own displacement from that land, and thinking about communal forms of ownership too, because this individual ownership is one thing, but there's also, you have models like land trusts and stuff like that that could allow folks to have that stability longer term, but folks often don't like that. There's a lot of pushback to that kind of model, even amongst BIPOC communities, because the perception is, well, if I put my land into kind of a community land trust, I'm going to lose this equity building mechanism.
I'll receive that as a yes and not a yes.
Yeah, it's a yes and. So anyway, there's a lot there, but I think the tension around the question of ownership is really interesting for me. Also because
it's a big one.
Yeah, Austin is a city that's 56% renter or more now, I think. So it's a majority renter city, but homeowners have absolutely dominated land use politics and conversation in the city. There's no doubt about it. So if tenants could, and a lot of that is because tenants often think of their situation as a temporary situation. And so they don't organize and build power from the position of tenants. And there's the sense that the tenants are transient, the tenants don't really care as much about the neighborhood, the tenants are coming and going. But if tenants could start to build collective power in Austin as tenants and really have a voice and participate in local politics as tenants, I think that would be a game changer in terms of stabilization and preventing displacement.
And one of the things, that he was getting at, and, to answer your question, let's say we did wave that magic wand, everyone is now housed. We now have to protect affordability because of those market forces that could ultimately end up driving people out of, the very housing. So we have to ask that question, what type of policies do we need to have in place to sustain and maintain affordability, because that's critical. And even with, the land ownership and the home ownership, one of the things that we've been looking at the federal level, we've seen the data where land appraisals, home ownership appraisals for equivalent properties are appraised at a higher value for white people and at a lower value for Black people. So even if they get to the point of having that ownership, then that equity in that ownership is at a lesser value because of the color of their skin. So how do we then have policies that maintain and sustain affordability and are also equitable?
But that's only the private appraiser. The taxing district doesn't look at it that way. You're not.
But even
I know it's
still-
worse. It's a.
So
double
if I'm building wealth, and let's say I need to use that equity in that home to pay for my child's education,
Yeah.
which a lot of people done, if that is being valued at a much lesser value, that's going to impact what I can do with that equity.
Absolutely.
I feel like you want to say something.
So many things.
Absolutely.
So I'm not, I don't know that I can answer the breadth of the question that you posed, but as, you know, folks were talking, I'm thinking about, you know, if I had 3 magic wands, right? If I had 3 wishes, right? What would those be in terms of impacting this issue? And I'm speaking more homelessness. So one of them is not related to housing policy. I mentioned Medicaid earlier, and I'm serious about it, y'all. You know, access to primary and behavioral health care is a huge piece here.
Yep.
So, you know, Medicaid expansion with adequate healthcare, wish number 1. Wish number 2 is related to what we've been talking about here. I think that we do in most of the affordable housing, deeply affordable housing you see built in Austin today, there effectively is a different form of land ownership, because even if there's a private developer in the deal, the city stays in as the owner of the dirt underneath it, so that property taxes are not charged, right? And there's a 40-year affordability period typically. Now, I'm gonna live another 40 years, right? My granny just turned 99 like a week ago. So I'm gonna be pissed in 40 years, right? That today I was confident about that 40-year affordability, but that's, you know, that piece. And the city has gotten more aggressive about acquiring property, but I think that's an important piece.
And using the property they have.
Correct.
For these
That's
purposes.
right. Yeah, you know, how many libraries do we have where we could rebuild and do a library on the first floor and whatever. And the third piece, and this is where I get to look down the table at my federal partner, is vouchers.
Yeah.
Right, so the Biden administration has talked about the potential. I think it was in one version of our Building Back Better plan, right, of providing adequate housing choice vouchers for everybody experiencing homelessness. And that, y'all, that's you know, I'm still giving up on it, right? And I'm sure y'all haven't either.
And I should tell folks, so a housing voucher is essentially a tenant-based subsidy, so a federal government program that provides a tenant or a household with the ability to pay the housing costs. Just wanted to clarify that.
And then if I would add onto your magic
Last
wand
word.
about the housing voucher, a footnote to your magic wand is that yes, more federal vouchers and then some way to address the source of income discrimination, which is quite prevalent in Austin.
Yeah, people gotta take the vouchers.
Yes, people gotta take the voucher.
Okay, I was gonna, somebody explain what that means, but
Source of, yeah,
that's
exactly.
literally what it is, so we have people on the market who are willing to accept the voucher as a form of payment. So other questions, other folks who might have questions?
I had a long talk with,
Oh, go ahead.
okay, so I had a long talk with a former council aide, John Gilvar, who now runs a nonprofit, and he's a consultant in Seattle, Washington. He told me that more rental assistance money would prevent a lot of homelessness. So can you speak to, you know, how much do we have for rental assistance and what are the prospects for getting more of that to prevent homelessness?
Sure, so in Austin, we have 2 housing authorities, we have probably 5,500 vouchers in the community, to a fact check the partnership. And so, you know, what I just spoke to was, you know, serving the folks who we know already are experiencing homelessness. And that's a very substantial number, right? With where we know there's 3,000 people who are homeless tonight, and currently we have 5,500 vouchers in the community as a whole, then that's, you know, that's not quite doubling it. But I agree, I mean, I think that there are so many people who are very low income, disabled, et cetera, who are just right at the margins. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that's sort of that voucher piece, and that's not the only form of rental assistance, but rental
The
assistance.
voucher is generally to get into an apartment. This is in the case of someone who has been there for a long
Like
time.
eviction prevention.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, and that's what he's really getting at, you know, in
Right.
terms
the
of
rent.
eviction
Yeah,
prevention.
yeah.
And one of the biggest things that we see as far as eviction prevention is concerned is the legal aspect of the eviction process. You know, we know from data that Black female-headed households, their primary reason for becoming homeless is they got evicted out of a rental unit. But what we found is that when you give them legal representation at the eviction process, that decreases the number of evictions dramatically. So if we're talking about preventing people who have been living somewhere for a long period of time, giving them legal representation during the eviction process is huge. So for instance, the city of Philadelphia, you know, they put, I think it was something like $2 million into having lawyers at eviction court every single day for anyone who needs one. And so that's a huge part of prevention, providing that legal assistance.
And also in Austin specifically, I think that the eviction crisis is dramatically worsened by COVID, as probably in most American cities. So there's a large population of low-income tenants who are basically, 3 to 6 months late on their rent and are being held in their apartments because of, moratorium on evictions the city was able to pass for a while, and in conjunction with county and some local judges participated in that, but that's expired. And the city had 2 tranches of the rent program. So there was rent and then rent 2.0. And that was rental assistance that went out to tenants. It was kind of a lottery system. You signed up for it if you got it. The county also put out some rental assistance. So there has been some money that has gone out that has sort of held the problem at bay. But the fact of the matter is there's a large population in Austin that is at the brink of eviction. And with our partners at BASTA, we also work on tenant organizing and collaborate with them. And they're doing a lot of organizing around this issue. Also with Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, there's representation in the courts, and we do courtroom solidarity watches during eviction hearings, where we try to encourage folks and organize folks to show up at eviction hearings in the courtrooms. But the fact of the matter is there's like a very real problem, and that number of 3,500 folks, which I tend to be on the camp that thinks it's a little higher than that, but whatever that number is, it could exponentially increase in the coming years if we don't have some way of preventing these thousands of evictions that are at bay right now.
I think there's got to be a component of it too that's sort of incentivizing property managers to keep people in units. I mean, I think I would advocate for a model that's similar to ours, in which yes, we want to move people into housing, and we also want to keep people in housing. Getting people out of our housing is the opposite of what we want to do, right? So I actually worked in our property management department for the first year that I was with Mobile Loads, and so I was in the office every first of the month with people coming in, either paying their rent or talking about why they can't pay their rent. And I will tell you, our property managers go to as far as they can possibly go with you to see how we can figure out a way for you to pay their rent. We think it's important to have guidelines around you have to pay rent to live here. That is the rule that everybody follows. And we have a legal landlord-tenant relationship with our residents. But it is within our core values to try to keep people in housing as much as possible. So we're going to hit this from every angle, right? First of all, we want property managers to be able to have a relationship with our tenants to some degree, right? So we want to make sure we know you, we know what you're about, we know what you're into. We foster a relationship where we've created a safe environment where you can come to us and be it's not going to happen this month, And then if you want to talk about it, great. We're going to figure out ways to plug you into employment if that's what you choose to do so that you can earn that. We're going to point you to some of the Travis County eviction prevention assistance programs for that. There are a lot of churches in the area too, actually, that do a lot of amazing eviction prevention stuff where they will come in and I actually think, I can't think of the church offhand, but There is a Catholic church that does, that funds eviction prevention. And usually one of the sisters from the church comes out and meets with the neighbor one-on-one, and, you know, brings a check and they pay their rent. And there's just a lot of ways that we can hit this if everybody shares the core value of let's keep people here. like what can we do to keep people here? And I think that can go a really long way. And then you don't find yourself in that eviction hearing, you know, having to show there. Can we, you know, stop from going there in the first place?
And sorry, I know I'm extremely guilty of
last
butting my.
question.
No, and tenants need to have their own organized power in this process, right? Tenants need to be able to have a voice in this process, and speak for themselves to their own needs in an organized way, because if one tenant or two tenants speak, then they can be retaliated against. But if they can speak together as an organized body, then they can get things from their management. So we need to see much more tenant organization.
And we've got right now in San Antonio, Austin, I think it's pretty similar. But 13 to 14% people living at the poverty level. What that means is they can't afford just basic living, housing, food. So, and I've heard that 2/3 of all people are one paycheck away from not being able to pay their rent or their mortgage. So this is a massive problem waiting to happen if it hasn't already. It's already big, but it's getting bigger. And if you look at just basic inflation right now at 7%, I don't know about you all, but my paycheck's not going up 7% this year. And I doubt that very many people are. That means more and more people, even if they are making the same amount of money they've made, are going to be entering into that poverty level. They won't be able to afford housing as number one, housing and food. And they're going to choose food before they choose housing. So this problem is also not just a housing at the bottom, it's a housing at every level. You know, a person who used to be able to afford a home here can no longer afford that or rent that apartment. So they're going to step down and they're going to step down, and we're going to be pressing people out at the bottom. We're going to be creating more and more people who are dealing with the issue that we're talking about today. And I think it's going to be massive unless we do some things to turn around the trajectory that we're headed on.
So last question, Dean, you will take our last question of the day and we'll have to keep our answers
If there's
short.
a student who has a question, I'll always
Is there-
answer the student.
We do have a student. If we can keep our answers short, I think.
Yeah, sorry, we talked.
We got this, we got
I'll
this.
stop.
Hi, I was gonna ask this question for Diane, but I'm very so sorry. But I am very so sorry. I wrote it down. I had like a whole list of questions that I wanted to ask. But what are the biggest obstacles that you face either from the city or like funders whenever you're trying to like in dealing with this issue?
Well, since I work for the city, clearly the city is not presenting any barriers. You know, I am being facetious, but also I have to say, like, we as a city, there's a lot of things we are still not doing right. We've also just committed $100 million to this issue, right? And so I think right now, you know, part of our barrier is we've got investment. This investment is one time, right? The city has annual investments. We're trying to figure out how to invest this and to build a system that's sustainable. And we've got some ideas about that, but that's an issue. And also, I mean, I think building out the providers and getting money into groups that haven't historically had, you know, had funding from the city. And so I think we are, and this is not the usual problem. If you had asked me a year ago, and probably every year for the last 20 years, I'd be like, well, we don't fund this adequately, right? Because we have not. Right now, we're really struggling with, okay, how can we deploy these resources that are more than we've ever had in the system to change fundamentally where we are as a community on homelessness.
Okay, Dean, well, go to you. Y'all are doing an amazing job.
Thanks, Chris, and this was amazing. I have not ever been to a better symposium. So such a shout out to Leora, I hope you're listening, to the work that Alan has done, to the work that these students have done, to work that all of you are doing in your lives. It's effing amazing, what you've been able to what you brought to us today. And I'm really grateful for this. I think what I have is not so much a question, but a provocation, and maybe it's a provocation for all of us to leave with. When we think about homelessness, and we've talked so much today about the multiple organ failure, the root causes of it, and we know they're manifold, and there are many places. And homelessness is a resultant, it's a consequence of that. And yet we think that it is the problem. And particularly for those of us in the design world, we want to solve the problem of not home with home. So we tend to focus at that level, and we're looking at solutions at that point and beyond. I think my question and my provocation is, what about on the other side of that? I mean, there's discussions obviously about, mental health, there's about health, the resources. I think the discussion about land ownership and all of that is really fascinating. But coming back to what we do as designers, and not after the fact, but how we even begin to think about how we design in the urban space, in public space, in the world. And so many of our precedents, so many of our rules for design, the percent affordable housing, the percent of parking, the mixed use ideas, whether or not we have accessory dwelling units, all of those things are gleaned from precedents that are in some cases decades, if not centuries old. And so we're analyzing this data, determining this is how much mixed use we need to have. This is how much affordable housing we should have. But not dealing with the situation on the ground now, which is changing so rapidly in Central Texas. If we think about how fast we're building in Central Texas, we can start to sort of begin to insert new ideas now. And we'll see those manifest within a year. So this is not a question of sort of looking way back in the past and trying to sort of like build upon that, but it's beginning to think about the changes that we can make now that might begin to sort of create that better sense of community, that might be able to sort of like provide those kinds of safety nets. But I'm talking right now, because we're at the School of Architecture, those things, that decisions that we make as designers, whether as planners, as urban designers, as landscape architects, as interior designers, and as architects, the kinds of decisions that we're making out there. What would be strategic? What are the kinds of things that we haven't questioned in the way that we design our urban environments that we should be designing? Too open-ended of a question, because that could be a whole other day. But I'm just sort of putting it out there because that's sort of what I've left with. I want to start, thinking about decisions that we can make now to begin to prevent some of what's happening. Not knowing that we're not going to be solving Medicaid in here, but it's okay. We do have.
Well, we may not solve Medicaid, but I will tell you, there's a recent report that came out from FEMA that people who live within a 15-minute walk of an open green space have 15% less healthcare costs than people who don't, right? So there are very real ramifications on health and wellness that grow out of the decisions we make as designers. So what I would say is, yes, we need to look at what are the real problems, and we need, as architects and designers and planners, say we're going to not shy away from the real human problems, but we're going to address them, and we're going to address them with design thinking, and even more importantly, we're going to design for human flourishing. we're gonna say, what does it look like for all people to flourish? And how are we gonna be making sure that things we touch and things we do are not set aside for a few, where some benefit and some don't, but they are, as Joe said, equitable, that they are really embracing of all of humanity, and that they give dignity and worth and value to every single human being that we are going to be privileged to work for. We have done projects that we've designed new cities in China for 500,000 people that get built within a few years of design. That's the scariest thing that you ever do, because you get so much wrong. So go into it with humility. Go into it knowing you're not going to get it right. Go into it asking people, inviting people, creating places that are invitational, that allow people to have agency over their space over time. And don't think that you're going to fix all the problems. Let people be empowered to fix the problems and provide a place for them to do that.
And I think that looking has to be constant and ongoing. I don't think I'm ever going to stop looking behind the problem, in front of the problem, because one of the biggest issues, if we look and let's say we implement policy and everything's good and everything's equitable, and I think you guys, from what I heard earlier, just experienced this, all it takes is a shift in mindset to undo it. And so how can we look in front of the problem, behind the problem, and implement policies and make it permanent, and make the hugest and the largest impact, and make it permanent and make it sustainable? Because overnight it can just shift, and now all of a sudden we're back where we were before.
Well, I just want to thank y'all. Like, I feel like I heard some, like great things to Dean's question. I'm hearing humility. I'm hearing looking. I heard hearing earlier, community engaged design, engaging with systems, building sustainably. And I feel like we're talking about a very deep conversation here. And of course, we could go on forever. I feel like we just put on our pajamas and sit here till then. We're not going to do that. So I just honestly want to thank y'all. Can we have a big hand of applause for all of us? Thank you, all of you. Thank you to the students who've been engaged in the panel and helping shape this question. I definitely want to thank the dean. I want to thank Dr. Sher. I want to thank Leora, Demi, Julia, Jonathan, Ashwini, Kelsey, Sarah Wu. And I definitely also want to thank the Office of the Executive Vice President, Provost, whose grant made this possible. So again, thank you all for being an amazing audience and engaging in a really deep conversation. Thank you.
I know, it's like,
Thank you.